Hello and welcome to episode 72 of the Game Dev Show. I'm here with Jason, Andrew, and Yorai. Today we're going to be doing a code review, going over some Unity code that was submitted by one of the viewers and talking about a couple of, I think, pretty interesting topics. I want to talk about networking, holograms, an interesting sale that's going on, and a couple other things. I got a little package under my desk that I want to share as well. So welcome, everybody. Hello, everybody in chat. And if you wanted to enter the giveaway, by the way, that's already up and open. All you've got to do is choose your race and class. Just put in a exclamation mark before. You'll see other people in chat doing it. Just copy them. So hello, everybody. Hey, guys. How's it going?
Hi.
Oh, and anybody recognize this guy over here?
I was about to ask.
Who's the newbie?
That's Jason Story's son.
Yeah. My dad couldn't make it, so I thought I'd join in for the day.
That's Jason Story Jr. today, and everybody's noticing in chat already. So, welcome everybody. How was your guys' week?
Long, full of reading, a lot of reading, documentation.
Nice. That was a lot of network documentation you were mentioning earlier, right?
Yeah, of more than one networking solution.
Nice. It's going to be interesting to talk about. I'm curious what you thought about those. What about you, Andrew? Anything going on this week?
Oh, so much stuff. Last week I'm still doing today videos and updates and doing all sorts of updates. I need to sleep more. I haven't been sleeping enough because I've been doing all this. Getting ready for a very exciting upcoming week this week. Lots of stuff going on with Infinity PBR to pay attention to. So this is like the public service announcement that if you aren't on my Discord or haven't gone to infinitypbr.com and signed up for my email list, you're going to miss out.
Although your wallet might be safer because I know it's going to cost me some money.
Yeah. You
Not
wait till
very much,
Thursday. Wait till Thursday and you won't have to spend much at all. Tuesday's a big day. Thursday's a big day. Thursday's a bigger day. They're separate though. The 2 days, they're completely separate. So
Tuesday and Thursday.
Yeah, Tuesday and Thursday. So everyone should be paying attention. What's up?
Today, you're also you gave us a code to give away a Scorpion too, right? So Sunday is a big day as well. So if you enter to win in the giveaway, we'll give this to who first place winner can pick what they want, the rider license or the Scorpion, and then the second place will get the other one. So yeah, go ahead and enter.
I have to say you got a really nice lighting on that image.
Thank you. I had some good advice from some friends.
It does look nice.
It does nice being able to compliment instead of criticize for a change, you know. That's
Oh yeah.
It's very, very pretty. Cool. And what about you, Jason?
Yeah, pretty good. I've been particularly busy with work the last 2 weeks. I'm currently rounding up a release of a Photon VR project, which is good. There was a couple of interesting issues to solve. It's like a painting app. It kind of is think like Tilt Brush, right? And so synchronizing a paint stroke across the network has been a fun challenge. Other stuff too, but that one in particular gave us quite a few headaches because you've got things like cap sizes and making sure the draw tick right. So that's a whole lot of stuff. But that's been a bit stressful. But what's cool about it is it's also got like a desktop front end. So I got to flex some of my UI UX stuff and do some nice like UI hub stuff, which I always like doing. And then on a personal note, as I said, I went out for a few whiskeys last night with some friends. So I'm not quite on full form. So you'll have to apologize if I'm not as exuberant as usual.
Does the beard grow back? Because you said you're not in full form, so...
Yeah, maybe that's what it was. Maybe it's because I'm so tired, the beard just receded. It'll come back later.
The real question is, did you leave with a beard and come back without one?
I wish. No. There was. I did actually shave beforehand. It wasn't really a plan. But the interesting thing is it probably is a good side effect because the weather's been so hot. Having less heat generators and storers on my face is probably a good thing.
It's the don't starve strategy.
Oh man! So are you guys ready? You want to jump over to the code review part now? We had a subscriber send in a set of code and a playable game. I think that I've linked it down below. Maybe I didn't link the playable game. I should do that as well. Let's pull it up real quick and dive into it. Actually, let me see if I can find. I'll pull up the game code first, or the playable version real quick first, so that everybody can see what that looks like. I just gotta find the right tab. I got too many of them open here.
So just in the meantime, to clarify, a few weeks ago, we've been asked if we'd like to do a code review, and since then we've gotten a few requests, and this is one of them, where somebody sent us a playable demo with free classes, and we'll just be looking for them and commenting on what we see that could be nicer to have.
All right, I've got it shared in chat, and now I'm going to pull it up on the screen so everybody can see. Run and go big. All right, so this is the game. It's a little platformer that I'm going to mute. There we go. And I didn't read the instructions. I missed some of them.
Left and right.
You read the code. You know what to do, Jason.
You run and you jump, and then you fall down here, and this guy tells you, "Hey, you fell down."
By the way, he makes games. He doesn't play them, right? So don't judge his skills. Just
And then I fell. Oh, and then one of these buttons shoots. I forget which one.
There should be a wall jump also.
Anybody know which button would
clearly get bombed?
I knew it. I used it before.
Isn't the mouse button?
No, it was one of the other buttons.
A and D were the two buttons I saw.
Come on, you can do it. Platform your way.
I've beat this already.
That's what they all say.
Promise.
What's the doubt button again? X, is it?
Yeah. Okay. Now, no shaming.
Okay.
Come on.
Okay. I'm terrible at this. See if I can make it all the way.
There you go. You did a wall jump.
You get all the way up here. And then I think up at the top, I'll get a backpack. And there was a way to shoot enemies. There's a hotkey, but I've totally lost track of what it is. See, so then you run over here, and then if I remember right, you talk to this little lady after you run past the helicopter. Yep, the helicopter was a nice surprise. Had to get back up, blah, blah, blah. And then you go down here, and then you get a bouncy platform. Pick that up, and I don't remember what to do after this. So let's take a look at the code. I don't want to have everybody just watch me play a game forever.
Well, now we'll never know if you actually beat it before.
You have to play for yourself to see.
All right, so here we go. Code is up, and I think I'm going to make this even bigger and make us...
if you go to the options, you can set it to Zen and distraction-free mode. It'll get rid of a lot of the cruft on screen. Do the pop-up. I think it's Control-T for me. I don't know what your hot menu thing is. Yeah, so if you go over to actions, there's one called Enter Zen mode and Enter distraction-free mode.
I've not seen this. Interesting. And how do you turn that off? You just go up here to off?
The same, yeah, you can just shrink that, or you literally do the opposite. Do exit Zen mode or exit.
Okay, Control-T.
There's also a second one, distraction-free mode. It'll turn off all of the lens stuff and all of the highlight, like IL code tags and stuff on the top if you want to do that as well.
Wait, sorry, what was that second one?
So there's actual enter Zen mode and then enter distraction-free mode as well. There you go.
Oh.
So they're just two different ones you can play with.
That is cool. It's nice, but I want to be able to see the line
stuff
numbers so
on
we
the
can
fly.
call them out.
I've been using that for like a year. It's fun. I guess Jason's tips section is back. I forget sometimes that I haven't talked about some of this stuff.
We haven't talked about tips in a long time.
Yeah.
No, we should do that. All right, this is not the right script. Where's the script that I want? I want the player script, not player previewer. And I've got this downloaded.
We've had the health controller, damage controller, and player script.
Yeah, I just opened the wrong one. There's the player script. Yeah. Okay. So let's see. Where do you guys want to start with this? You all right? Did you have thoughts on it? I know you took a really close look.
Yeah, so I think it would be cleanest to start with the health controller because it does the least, and then as we go over the other ones, we'll see how they interact with the too. So first off, we should probably do a quick rundown of what this class actually has.
Sure.
Yeah, so for the people reading, if there's compression issues or anything, it's basically a class called Health Controller. It has fields for health and also images, which are part of the UI system in Unity. And depending on the amount of health the player has, the purpose of this script is to change the sprites on these UI images to show how much health you have.
Those little hearts right there.
Yeah. And there is also a function to play a sound in this class, but you'll soon see that it's actually never getting called within this class.
Nope, no references.
Or at all, yeah. I assumed it was part of an external code, but I couldn't
no.
You know,
I mean, it could be, but it could just be not in the code that we have access to.
Yeah,
because this isn't the full project. This is just a small chunk of it. It could be called by something else.
So,
well, in the interest of keeping my reputation as being particularly judgmental, I'm going to start my complaints from the first few lines. So
yeah, go ahead.
So
just a disclaimer first for everybody watching. We are criticizing this code only for pointing out things that would help you in the future, and we're not trying to be mean on this. This is clearly for the purpose of helping, not...
Your eyes trying to bully you.
No angry letters.
I'm
and
writing...
I will say, I do consulting and contracting. I've seen a lot worse code, and even then, there's a fundamental difference between code that's bad by design or lack of understanding, or stuff that's just stylistic choices that make your life easier. So nothing here is particularly egregious. It's purely just there's a term in software where we call it being a good citizen, and it's the idea of how good is your code for other people to consume. And so a lot of the tips that I'm going to talk about specifically are going to boil down to how do you make code other people will go, that's nice, I like using that. So it's not really about being good or bad. It's just there are things you write for yourself, and there are things which stick out to other people kind of later on. So with that being said, my very first comment is going to be on the actual class name. Now, again, this is contentious, different people have different opinions, but I'm a big fan of removing what's called noise words. And so any word, the whole point of software and like why we write it in a language that's not actually bytecode or machine code is because it's meant to communicate information. Every single word in your script is doing something. It is telling you what it is, what it does, and what your attention is. And so in this case, health controller, sure, it controls health, but what is the difference between calling it that and just calling it health in this instance? Now, if you have different kinds of health or health data, there might be reasons and whatever. But at the end of the day, it may control health, but it's also the health. It is just health. And so words like health controller, health system, health manager, that word doesn't actually give you any additional information. In the case of a character controller, that is different because a character controller very specifically has a connotation. There is a character and there's a character controller, and they do different things and they have different names and use cases. So as a general rule, try to ask yourself just, is the name communicating something? And if it isn't, no need to really use it. So I'm curious. I imagine other people have different opinions on this. That's just my particular take. So I'm curious if anybody else would have named the class health, or if that's too small, doesn't give enough context for them. I wonder what everyone else's opinion is.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I generally agree, but on this class, it would probably be named Health UI, and the health and max health part would be yanked out because the majority of this code is around modifying the UI part of the health, probably 2/3 of the code, or at least 50% of the code. And then another quarter of it is changing the actual health, and another quarter is a sound thing that's not part of this really at all.
That is a good point with intent. And actually, you bring up a very good point worth mentioning. When it comes to naming things, it can often be really hard to know what to name something, because as a project grows, a class changes. And so oftentimes you might sit there and, rack your brain and going, what do I even call this thing? Is it a health system? Is it a health manager? Is it a health UI? And one of the biggest mistakes people make is waste a whole load of time trying to guess the correct name out of thin air with no information. And so what you should do, and it's perfectly fine to do this, start with a name, call it health stuff, thing that does health, whatever the hell you want, just call it something. And then don't let don't let that distraction be an issue. And then as the project grows, it may change what it's doing. Very frequently you'll work on something and you'll be like, oh, hang on a second, I'm noticing this isn't doing the thing I thought it was. It's actually more to do with UI stuff or whatever, at which case now it's a good candidate to change the name. Names don't have to stay static throughout the lifetime of a project. We have editors can be refactored. You should change names as often as it makes sense to do so. Again, it's about communication, and if something changes what it's doing and you need to recommunicate what it's doing instead, feel free to do so. So health UI would actually be a very good candidate here, as you said, based on what it's doing.
Yeah, and then I just move the other stuff out of it into probably one of these other classes, or maybe a new one. Do you guys have more on this specific class? Should we just go through it more?
There's a lot on the implementation of the contents. Yeah.
Although one thing just to highlight on this too, on the name thing, this is just again personal tip that I like to do. Take or leave it. Even if we did change the name, the fun fact is the name you see in Unity on the label has nothing to do with the class name. It defaults to the class name, but it doesn't have to be the class name. And so what I actually like to do personally is I don't like having messy class names on the actual items themselves. And so what I would do is I'd add a component. So people are familiar with the create asset menu, but there's a different one called an add component menu. And so I will put that on almost every single script I use. In this case, I put one on here. And so it's an add component menu, and you can give it a folder description. And that folder, when you click add component and it goes through that sub menu, you can put your code there. But the second side effect of that is the last entry in that set is the name of the script. So what I would do is I would say JSON story /UI/health. And what that would do is mean the actual name on the script would be just the word health, and it would be on the UI, and it would exist in the UI folder category inside the picker. So that gives you both, gives you the best of both worlds. You could call the script health UI, but then it would just be called health on the component itself. Again, personal preference. I can see why some people wouldn't like that, but it's just, I like.
Yeah, that
I
would
like
scare me because I'd worry that people are going to get lost trying to figure out which file it is. Anybody that doesn't realize that's what's happening.
That concern is kind of not based in reality because there is still the script drop, like the grayed out. This is your script.
You just double click on the script. Yeah.
Or even if it's a custom script, because again, I do this all the time, so it's worth noting. If someone's overwritten it with a custom editor and you lose that grayed out portion and that freaks you out and you don't know where it is, you can always still click the triple dot menu and go to edit script there. So.
Yeah, the only real issue I think with that is that I would probably still want to have a separate script that was actually just the health. It'd have a health UI and a health. So it's the real problem.
Just a separation of responsibilities between a health presenter and the actual health values.
Yeah.
Also worth mentioning is that there is actually no method modifying the amount of health in this class. Which is something that is already showing the functionality isn't actually here. It's just the presentation and the storage.
This is just updating it.
The display of
whenever it's called by whatever. I think it's called by the damage controller one.
Yeah, it changes by the damage controller. It's limited in the update health method, but there is absolutely no reason for it to be there per se. If you go back to the health controller class, we can actually get into the more nitty-gritty of things that could be changed.
Honestly, rather than, because what we're currently talking about is like the structure of the class and what order and stuff, and we can get to that, but I think honestly just there's some of the more small system stuff that I think to cover first. Like for example, the use of public. That's the first thing. Like literally the next line I think is worth discussing as well. So I've talked about this before, and I have a video that's like an hour and a half long over on the Infallible Code channel where I talk about literally just that line, the variable line, and what you do with it and why you use it. I won't reiterate an hour's worth of talking about that, but I will say, in general, making something public is perfectly fine when you're like doing quick tests and setting stuff up. But as a general rule, you should almost never have public fields. You can have public properties, you can have public methods, but a field being public is to me a bit of a red flag. Now, that's not saying you never do it, but there's a whole different conversation about data structures versus objects. You should never have public fields on objects, in my opinion. And so in this case, as a general philosophy, I notice with the next three, you've got the private serialized field, and there's clearly an inconsistency here that new ones have been added on top. I would just say repeat that process, maintain the same serialized field, and private. And then again, on a personal note, we're talking about noise words. This is another contentious one. Other people won't agree. That's fine. Personal style preference. I don't like words that don't add value. And because by default things are private, adding private to me is just extra words. Some people like it because it keeps alignment and it makes things that are public-private have the same spacing. I don't think that's a good enough excuse. So I literally tell Rider to switch its mode so that it doesn't put the word private in front. And so suddenly you're cutting out a whole pile of pointless words in your entire application. It's removing all of the privates across. So this would literally say int health, int max health, and serialized field. It would be a lot shorter and more compact.
Yeah, so another smaller nuanced thing is that there are inconsistent underscores. That was already brought up by the comments. But when you have
privates too, that audio clip one
Yeah.
doesn't have the.
Yeah, so generally speaking, the underscore has a meaning in that when you have parameters and variables within a method, you usually use camel case with them, and that is perfectly fine. And you have your code manipulating values within those methods. But you want to have some distinction between your variables that only exist within the scope of a method and fields that stay after the method is done. The underscore usually is used to signify that, and also that the field in question is private. Generally speaking, as Jason said, public fields should not be a thing for objects. This is mainly because it's difficult to track down what manipulates them after the fact. There are properties for that which tend to be with Pascal case, which means starting with the big letter, no underscore. This is a better separation that you know what you're messing with as you read a method. You don't have to go up and check what stays after you're done and what doesn't. So there's that, but there are also some few things I wanted to point out with the actual update health method that I think.
Okay, just before we get to that, another small thing is I'm majorly against comments in general. Like, there's another contentious debate with a lot of people. I don't really use comments in most of my code. I don't find them that useful. It's good for annotating like we're doing here, but it's different than actually like informational in the code. But one thing that even people who do use comments agree on, commented code is literally the worst. It is the devil. It is the monster that like starts to infect your code. Because what happens is if you put a commented out method in your code, well, why? Are you thinking, I might come back to it later, I might want to use it. What you've now done is you've added a small brain worm that every time you open that script to make changes, you're going to inherently read the script and go, what was I using that for? Do I still want to use it? And it's going to end up muddying your decision making when what you're actually there to do is add some feature. And all of a sudden you're going to be making changes and decisions based on existing old code that may not even work referenced to name variables that have changed. So if you're really worried you're going to lose something personal, that like you had an idea or you might forget an algorithm, use source control. Put your code in source control, delete that code and that method entirely, and then you don't need it. It's still available to get access to, but it's not going to muddy up your code and it's not going to mess with your thinking about how to solve future problems. So don't leave commented code in your scripts ever, under any circumstance.
There's also another fallacy with having commented code, which is you have to start maintaining it as well as your code. You're giving yourself more work to do, and that work has no value. Your code should be explaining what it's doing by the mere gesture of reading it.
Yeah, I always want to delete commented stuff before committing. Like, I'll comment things while I'm experimenting for a few minutes, but it usually shouldn't sit there for more than an hour. then it's going to be gone and deleted by the time it gets in. So I already killed that part of it. So you guys want to go on to the update health?
I would say though, for me, I do write comments. I'll be the contrarian here. I do write comments to remind myself why I did things oftentimes. And I've even gotten so far now to start adding dates, so I remember when I wrote that comment, so I can be like, oh yeah, now I remember why I was doing that day, and that's why I was doing it like this and other things.
The only time that I use comments in actual production code or for personal projects is that when the comment explicitly tells you something that you cannot explain in code. So if you make a decision that doesn't seem rational or is affixed to a hack and it doesn't read as part of the rest of the code, I would comment specifically saying fix 4 and the ticket number that is in question, and maybe a piece of small logic and my own name there, just so that if anybody else tries to go over it later, they can ask me if I can provide extra context in case there was not enough.
At enterprise scale, there's the general concept of people use multiple tools, one of the biggest ones being Confluence for this kind of thing. And the idea is having a knowledge base. I've talked at length about how much I like knowledge bases and all that stuff, so we won't cover all there. But I will say that Yuri brings up a good point here, which is it's tempting to put code in line to or comments in line to go, oh, I did this because this reason. But you're kind of restraining yourself because now you're feeling like, well, I want to comment what I did, but I also don't want to put too many comments in. And so you're trying to subphrase what you did in a way that's small enough to be there, but not muddy up the code. And so what's often done is, like Yuri said, is you put some kind of key or annotated note that links to something else. And so the idea would be you have a small ID that says fix 7. It doesn't have to be a sensible thing. In proper management system, there's actually auto linking, and you can have special IDs and it'll do a lot of work for you. But the short answer is, if you have an external website or something, like in your case, Andrew, you're using a lot of the Git pages thing, you could have a Git pages section, even a private one for yourself, and just annotate stuff that you've done and why, and then the code could just have 1825, and you could go look up 1825 and you could write an essay. You could put links. If it was a problem where you're like, I don't know why, I don't know how to solve this problem, I'm kind of back and forth on the algorithm, you could link to 3 different algorithms you've tried. You could link to the YouTube video that you're looking at to research the problem, and now you're not constrained to just 1 or 2 lines of a half-hearted summary of what it is you're trying to do. You could fully express it and just have a reference in the code.
Yeah.
I know it's more work, but again, a lot of this stuff comes down to you have to balance what makes sense for you and your workflow.
Yeah, and if you're also working with non-humane values, which is something that is pretty nuanced, but sometimes you do actually have to do that, comments can explain what the non-humane value is. For example, if you're writing a WAV file manually after you've sampled audio for God knows why you're doing it in code, you have to write out bytes in a very specific order for the header of the file, for example. And you have to write things like random, what is a subchunk size? And you could declare a variable and start doing all that. But the truth is you want the code to be as short as possible for convenience of reading it afterwards. So you could have write 18, which is the subchunk size, and you'll just use that as a comment. And then PCM format is also 1, the amount of channels you have, etc.
I do the same thing for when I do Windows interop stuff. So if you're trying to write code that directly, here's a fun fact for you. There is no code in C# that will send something to the recycle bin. You can't do it. You can delete a file, but you can't delete it to the recycle bin. And so you have to do some very interesting stuff where you import Visual Basic to get access to the ability to delete the recycle. It's a whole thing. But there's other stuff too where you can also do it by directly accessing the shell and writing a shell command which references a pointer which does the Windows operation that would do the same thing had you done it yourself. And so that can lead to a lot of very interesting code where you're writing literal pointer positions of 0x whatever to get to the position of that thing, and those are perfect candidates for comments. And the other one I use comments for a lot is I suck at maths. I am very, very, very bad at maths. And what I do often is when I'm researching a problem, specifically something that's well known, like sorting algorithms, or there's a lot of really interesting stuff for string comparisons and doing fast, any kind of fast algorithm that solves a very unique problem. Oftentimes they have names, or even complicated algorithms for stuff. One I talked before is about Levenshtein distance. I use that a lot for string lookups to make it easier. I don't remember what the hell the code's doing. And I did stuff as well for cycling shapes and calculating positions along a rhombus for something else. I was lots of little stuff that's well beyond my ability, but it's a Google search away. I found the code, put it in the project. And so I can't refactor that into nice friendly. Just do the thing where you get the angle that's half the thing of the pi of the wood. I don't know what this is doing. So I will not only name the method, I will name the method the algorithm itself. So the method will be Levenshtein distance. I would never call a method that myself. So I'd look at that and go, oh, that doesn't mean anything to me. And so I put a comment on that to say, this is a search algorithm that does X, link to some additional resource for that. So that's about the only place that I very consistently will put comments in.
Yeah. So going forward.
Yeah, let's continue on. I didn't have anything to add in there other than I completely agree. All the situations you guys gave were exactly what I've seen in every AAA place and every other game company. comment the stuff that is confusing and that you would need to, and that's it.
Yeah.
Except I have seen lots of commented code, to be honest.
Actually,
that needs to get deleted, but everybody's afraid to delete it because nobody knows why it's there and commented.
Yeah, the fear of green code commented out. There is also one more thing that's actually worth pointing out for comments: regex that you only used once. How did you get your information from point A to point B? I used this regex. Nobody else has to use it. I'm not calling actual code for it. I just use some online interpreter. But this was the regex I used.
Yeah. The regular expressions, I hate them. I always hated regular expressions, and I'll never be convinced to not hate them.
They're amazingly cryptic.
Yeah, they're really powerful ways to break your project. I do enjoy them a lot. They're one of those things where they do feel a little bit like magic. I actually wrote one yesterday to do email parser, because I had to specifically make sure that an input field was in fact an email, and that's surprisingly more complicated than you think. And so there's a few regex stuff that I've done in the past that I got
just a few thousand characters to just copy paste from somewhere because emails are the hell.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So, going to the actual method implementation, shall we?
Yeah. Let's jump back into it. So, update health.
Yeah. So, at a glance, this method is literally only setting the health to never be above max health, and then updating the sprites so that you have all the hearts showing the proper value, and if you actually don't have enough hearts, disable some of the images. So there is the notion that maximum health can be changed, and then also that the actual health contents themselves can change with that.
Yeah, and so what's interesting here, the biggest two things that stick out to me is, well, one, I never like having a loop statement that's longer than like 4 lines of code. If you're actually doing a loop, it ends up getting quite big and it's confusing to catch the brackets. Now, I don't want to change that because we can actually make this short enough that wouldn't be an issue. And so the thing that I really want to highlight is the fact that there's a lot of if-elses here that are fundamentally doing a check for true or false. And so there's an interesting thing that a lot of people I think don't really understand about C# or actually about programming in general, which is that in 90% of cases, anything which evaluates to a value is interchangeable from that value. And so what I mean by that is if something turns out to be true or false, it can be used in place of true or false. And if something evaluates to a number, it can be used in place of that number. Can this be abused? Yes. But in cases like this, having if I less than max health, this is true, this is false, could just be changed to enabled equals I is less than max health. Now, in certain contexts, that can be less readable, but honestly, given the line is so small, any confusion with a name like that doesn't bother me in the slightest. I would probably still do that. I would just one-line it so that both of those functions could be just, that could be 2 lines of code rather than the entire set of the ifs, else, if, else.
Yeah.
Before we fix that, what do you think about 31 and 32? Is something
that they should be outside the loop? Yeah,
so
that was the first thing I was about to bring up.
That one can be moved up here.
Yeah.
And then you want to show them how to change that, or should I just hit the is it going to offer me the writer refactor?
I don't think it'll auto refactor this. You have to do it yourself. So
there's actually something before you try to do that, because there's actually a deeper problem that's not in the code itself in the first in lines 34 to 37. Do you guys spot it?
Let's see.
Oh, by the way, I've not even been reading the code. I've just been reading the processing the formatting.
So if I is less than health, then we get a full heart. So if I is 0 and health
that's not the problem. Isn't the code per se, but rather the field in use. There is actually something in the image class called an override sprite, and you're meant to use that instead of sprite when you're actually assigning a sprite. There is
that's interesting. I didn't know that. I'm curious. Tell me more about that. I literally never heard of this. So
yeah. So you know how when you have a base value, and you know that at one point you'll want to come back to it, having to maintain that original value and setting it back yourself isn't the most intuitive. It's a destructive action if you're changing the base value. So Unity provides you a very clean field for it.
You've blown my mind. I do that. Literally, I wrote this today on a project, I wrote a sprite equals cache the old one, maintained it, and stored it myself. I didn't know this existed. I've now got some refactoring to do. That's great.
Yeah. So when you want to change an image to another image temporarily through runtime, what you should use is override sprite. This actually exists for multiple things in Unity, most of the renderers. Not exactly with this name, of course, but it does exist, should be used, and this lets you always go back to the original value cleanly, not having to maintain it, which is especially troublesome when two things try to change the current image to something else.
Oh, that's such a nightmare. Yeah, I've had those situations for like highlight effects and things, and you go back and go, oh, two things changed it, so there's no previous store of the old one. So I would have to manually cache the very first one first to have it, so I could always have a reset function I wrote myself. And yeah, this saves a lot of stress.
It blew Jeff's mind too. That's definitely a good tip.
Yeah. So the thing I would do first is change that to override sprite, and also this would require a change in the inspector, because if the empty heart was not already assigned, or the full heart, for whichever one you decide is the override, you'll have to set that in the inspector. So we can not touch that for now, but in addition to that, something that I do recommend doing is caching the heart's eye, because this is being accessed 4 times here. And should you want to change how this is accessed, you're going to have to change all 4 of these lines. So caching heart, var heart equals heart's eye at the start of the loop.
Plus, it's just linguistically cleaner. Like, let's be real here. The brackets of a array syntax causes like a brief blip in your brain of like, oh, that's getting a value from an array. What value is it? And it causes mental processing. If you change it to heart, it's the word heart, and everything past that point is now considerably easier to like mentally reason about. So suddenly all of those lines of code are now just one line of code, right? It's a lot easier. Yeah. And then for this one, you're going to probably have to use the Elvis operator, because it's not
ternary
just
operator.
Yeah, the ternary, fine. I honestly, I don't know. There's just something fun about calling it the Elvis operator.
Yeah.
So like this, but I can't get it to scroll. Let's get this on a new line. Here we go. There we go.
Jason's story. Mr. Blackspoon asked in the chat something I know you know the answer to. Why would you use var if you already know the variable type?
I would pose you the counter question. Why do you need to know the variable type when var will do just fine and it's less mental processing?
I don't need to write the word heart again, or what is it? No,
right?
Image. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just var. Like this is again. This gets to a much deeper philosophy of code and stuff, but almost every decision I make with my styling of my code comes down to how much information am I imparting with the words I'm writing, how much do I need to impart, and how do I put as little cognitive load on the person reading my code. And writing heart, or even if you know the name or the type or whatever, one, it doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter. Your code shouldn't be dependent on that type. It should be functionally working. A more mechanical reason that is, if it's not just about the philosophy of code for me, is simply if you change it to something else, you now have to change every single place you've written heart. If you've made a new class called health heart or heart system, or you've switched to health bar, suddenly every single place downstream has to change to support that. If it's var, it's dynamically typed, and it will magically fix itself automatically for each and every one of those because it'll assign the right type. So there's both a clarity reason and also a pragmatic one for your code.
Yeah, I recommend putting the type there if it's not obvious, but that's it. So like if the method is returning back something and it's not obvious what it's returning back, and for some reason you can't change it to make it so that method's obvious, then I like to have the name of the thing there so that I know exactly what I'm dealing with and I don't have to guess. But usually I like to have the thing that I'm assigning it from kind of tell me implicitly what the thing is, so I don't have to duplicate that and deal with changing it like Jason was saying.
On the argument, somebody said they like to use the type so they understand what type it is. If you hover over the word var, it tells you what the type is. There's no reason to have that information visible on the code when it literally tells you. Like if you, like Jason, hover over the word var there on the heart. Are you in the
mouse? Yeah.
Like, oh, you're not. It's not.
Oh, yeah, I'm not.
Yeah.
It's not in
project setup. Yeah.
Right.
The file's not part of the project, but if I go to one of oh wait, this isn't part of the project.
Okay. So basically,
Either way,
the IDE can show you that, and also sometimes the IDE would straight up just put the word near it without you having to hover at all. as long as it's running like in a context that it is aware of everything that's part of the project, which it usually would
like
be.
it literally tells you what it is. So there's like, to me, that's not a good, because again, we're talking about, like, I'm not saying hide information so people can't find it. I'm saying there's information you need up front, and there's information that you can find later if you need it. And realistically, you don't need it unless you need it. And so removing extra information is usually a good deal until you actually need that information. And so in 90% of cases, a lot of your editor stuff will do it for you. Like, think about something else that you don't think about, which is oftentimes you have to jump between base classes and parent classes. That's another thing people don't like doing. They're like, I have a hard time finding out what extends this and which whatever. Again, on the editor, there's something called overrides or overloads and stuff. You can actually click on the script and it'll say things using this script and things this extends from. And you can walk up and down relative to it from the code lens is what they call it. So in general, you don't need to bake as much information into your scripts these days because the editor is very smart and is doing a lot of stuff for you.
And I'd like to point out that for all the people arguing for the value, it wasn't even there to begin with. It was accessed via Heart's Eye. The type was never in the code to begin with.
Yeah, on the hearts, yeah. You would have had to go back up to hearts up here to find it.
Yeah.
Or put your mouse over it.
Now, one thing, because I've been kind of harping on specifically about minutia of code, I should probably at least address the code itself and what it's doing. A bigger philosophy thing for me on this, from an actual like what the code is doing perspective, is the fact that at the, excuse the pun, heart of the problem here, you are updating the sprites relative to something happening, but this update is happening all the time, and the
it's
fact
actually
of the matter
not.
Is,
this one's not in an update.
well, it's not. I thought I saw in update there was update health, wasn't it? I guess it's the
method is called update health.
Okay, well, actually,
maybe it is from somewhere else, but I think
this brings up a good point on names. Then update has a connotation in Unity. It means updating. And so by choosing to call it update health, that is telling me that it's updating the health. And I presume it's updating on an update loop. This comes down to information. I know it's small things and people might consider it nitpicky, but we're talking about how you process things, the mental load of the code you're doing. And my instinct went to Unity uses the word update to mean an update. And so I will intuit that and follow that convention throughout my code. If you use those same names, I'm going to treat it the same way. So I use the word update when I'm doing updates, and I don't use them in things that are happening on events that handle things. So if you're altering the health or changing it, or you're doing something to update the value of it, ask yourself if the names make sense for what you're doing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because and when I saw this initially, I thought it was in an update too. So I went and looked to see where it was getting called from. I was like, oh, it's getting called every frame. I literally thought that too. I was like, oh, that's weird. Why is it calling every frame? And I was like, oh, no, it's not. I think that's a very good point. It's something we should remember to mention in the future. Like using those keywords is important to not misuse them. So
playing the devil's advocate here, I didn't start from this class, so I already knew this isn't getting called every frame because I didn't see an update method, and I saw another code calling this first. But while I do agree that the update method name is kind of important in Unity, the IDE is already telling me if this is called frequently or not, so I have a better indicator of is this the actual update method or not, and I didn't have any problem whatsoever with that. Also, the public keyword on that method was actually another hint, because usually when you write in the void update in Unity, you don't actually include either the keyword or it's going private because nothing else knows.
Oh yeah, but I didn't think it was the Unity update. I thought it was, because what I do is I have an update function, and then inside the update method, I don't like putting code in there specifically, so I will have in the update health, update animations, update whatever. So my presumption was it was a trickle down of update is calling 3 sub updates. That's kind of what I assumed was going on.
Fair. So my feedback for this class is basically done. We can move to another one if you guys are good.
Let's just have a quick scan, I guess. Again, just a small thing. Like I said, personally, it's probably fine in some of those amounts. But yeah, I think we've covered most of this. I would say as well, just a small thing. In the random at the bottom, you're using the random. It'll do that. It's perfectly fine to put it inline, especially if it's only a one-time use, to use the namespace on the thing. But as a general rule, there are already namespaces at the top. I mostly try to stay consistent with that. The only time I will ever put Unity Engine dot in front of something is when I'm about to use directives. If you're using specific code directives where you're doing like if Unity editor, if Android, if whatever, and you don't want to also have to do the ifs at the top, that's perfectly fine. But again, it just makes more sense in most cases to just write using Unity Engine at the top and then not having to have additional, again, more words that don't add new information to the method you use.
This doesn't actually need to be there unless the using systems up top, which was probably there at the beginning, and probably why they probably have it there and added it. Go ahead.
Before we actually leave this class, Mr. Diego Sun in the comments brought up why not implement an event call inside the setter of health. So there is some nuance to this, but I will point out that the proper workflow, if you did want to store the health value in this class, would have been to make methods that manipulate health and then call update health. Right now, what actually happens is the other classes are setting the health and then calling update health when they do that, which is a waste because you could just do that within the class.
Yeah, whose job is it, right? Like you're basically asking health to do something and then telling it to do something to update the state to fix what you've just told it to do, as opposed to just telling it to do it in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. So a simple piece of code like that, and then they're moving the exposure to everything. You might want to add serious field to both of them, yeah.
Well, health, I don't think you want serialized, right? Because that's...
Well, it depends on how the unit starts, because there isn't anything that sets it at the beginning, so you kind of have to assume that, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I admit it's driving me insane that it's not part of the project, so none of the IntelliSense is coming up. It's just sort of one of the fixes. One other small thing as well. Again, I'm trying to make a very clear definition between stuff that I think is good practice in general versus stuff that's my personal preference. And so I'll always preface when it's like, this isn't a recommendation for everyone. This is just how I like code. And so this next one's under that category. Something Jason brought up earlier, which is a very good point, is there are two types of random. Well, there's obviously multiple, but in Unity's universe, there's stuff under the system namespace and there's stuff under the Unity engine namespace. And
there's also one on the mathematics namespace.
Yeah, well, yeah, but you're not going to trip up on that one accidentally normally, though. That doesn't usually happen. So I guess my point is, there are multiple ways to solve this. The usual case is you import one of the other, and usually system's the first one because system includes most of the stuff you're using, and then you end up having to deal with the prefaced whatever. Now, again, personal preference. Don't take it as gospel. I like to use namespace aliases, and so there's random, and then there's what I call Unity random, and I will very explicitly at the top of my code write, using Unity random equals Unity engine.random. And what that does is it renames the script. And I use capital U for that because it's the same as...
I missed my shift there.
So now, if you were to use Unity random instead down below, it'll work instead of the word random, which is suddenly, instead of Unity engine at random, it's now Unity random. Every place you need it, you're not going to get collisions with other kinds of things. And this works for everything. I do this a lot when I'm using third-party libraries or something that might have an enemy or a health or something, and I want to use part of their code, but I don't want their code to confuse my code. So if there's a class in another system,
something like that, that should just be like the wrapped version of it, like the default. Just to
get I mean, you could. I thought about that before too, building my own like random system or something, and then just you basically using it as a wrapped layer. But honestly, again, for simplicity purposes, that would lead to a cognitive overhead, where people would have to then click on it and find out what it's doing.
In Unity, it should be done like that. Like it should just be part of the library. Just add an alias there, or like make it so that you can do it. Because it is one of the few things that catches people up all the time. They get that error because they added the using system namespace and they get so confused. And namespaces aren't that common for Unity devs, so a lot of the time they just get completely stuck because they tried to add a random or something else in their random ship code. So
there is another use case for this, just to sell people an alias a bit more, which is when you're working with different platforms or implementations by different providers, you can actually, if there is parallelity between the code, you could just use an alias with an if-def going, if you're using this platform, the solver for whatever problem you have is actually the implementation of that platform's class. And if you're using another platform, the solver is another solution.
100%. In fact, a manual version of this I do for myself is I would if I have an input system and there's a jump button, I would do a Boolean property called is jumping or should jump or whatever, and then I would use an if-def between the two different Unity input systems down below that both have the exact same named property. And so the result is I can write in the update if should jump or whatever, and then regardless of which input system, it just turns on or off that one line property. So you can literally use that as a like compile time switch statement.
Yeah.
One other thing too is, again, this is way off scope for this stuff, but it's kind of getting interesting. Another thing about Unity Random is, I'll be honest, it happens so often that you want to just randomize something that, again, personal preference, not major recommendation. That's a perfect candidate for an extension method from my perspective. There's no need to be constantly dealing with using the import Unity Random, do all the stuff. As I actually, myself and Andrew wrote this code in like a couple of streams back on his channel. I just make a .take random, and it'll just take a random value from the list. And you, from a like clarity of naming and stuff like we talked about, it's so much easier in your code to just write list.take random, and you don't have to worry about the indexes and the position, whatever. Now in this case, it's using the index for other stuff, and so that's different. But in general, if there's something like that that feels like a natural addition to a class or system, you can make an extension method.
And on that note, you can also extend the random itself if you have a lot of very specific use cases. So for example, in Terraria, we use the normal system random, but we randomize a lot of our particles manually because you don't use Unity. We don't have a particle system. So we made extension methods, for example, random point in circle. What multipliers is the radius of the circle? Well, it's up to us. It's arguments. Circle edge in rectangle, in random float from 0 to 1, because that happens way too often, etc.
Yeah, and this also works for other cases too. Like if you go back to the code there, Jason, one thing just to show it doesn't work now because we haven't made the extension methods, but how this line of code would look for me had I written it. So if you just copy 55 and paste above it, Jason, we'll just demonstrate how this would look if I was writing it.
Sure.
Yeah, just the title. I mean, just the function, the header of the thing. Because I want to do an expression body member. Yeah, so do that. Expression body member.
Story mode.
Yeah, story mode, sure. And then just do an arrow. Yeah, and then on the next line, I would just write underscore audio dot play. No, just audio, because I wouldn't call it audio source personally. And then capital P play, and then in brackets I would just write underscore sounds dot take random, or just dot random or take random, whichever. Yeah, and then round brackets at the end of take random. So that's how this exact function would have looked had I written it, because I would have made the two extension methods. One, I hate the fact that you're constantly assigning a clip and then pressing play when you should just be able to play a clip. So I would have made an extension method that does both of those things in one, and then I would have made a second extension method which gets a random element from a list. And so even though they're doing the exact same thing, from an intent perspective, you can see exactly what I'm trying to do on line 54. Audio, play, random sound. I don't need all of this randoms and indexes and namespaces and audio sources. All of that is what I constantly say is implementation details. You want to hide implementation details. You want your code to read like your intent. What are you trying to do? What I'm trying to do is audio, play, random sound. And you get all of that information. No extra mess, no fuss, no extra code syntax in line 54.
Now, I know we're harping about reducing the amount of code you have, but the reality is the more code you have, the more you have to maintain it, the more time people spend reading it, which is actually where most programmers spend their time. You're writing less than you're reading if you're doing any sort of production. And when you have less code, you have less to maintain, less to think about, and it's easier to change things because you know there's not much that you'll have to touch.
All right, I gotta interrupt here because I just saw what was happening in chat. I don't know if you guys saw it. I just want to say thanks to Snarf. Just gifted out a ridiculous number of memberships to people, which is freaking amazing.
Nice.
Yeah, I don't. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's awesome. Wow, I was just shocked. I saw the chat, but in Restream I can't see all of the little pop-ups and stuff, so I didn't realize they were popping up. So what's all the chat about here? And I saw it. Anyway, cool. Thank you so much. That's freaking awesome. Okay, I'll shut up with my interruption. Sorry,
No,
it popped up and it's like, whoa.
Yeah. So, sorry about that, everybody. I'm just feeling a bit sick. Yeah. So, I think we should move to the next class, and I think it
Yeah.
should be damage controller before we touch the player, because players traditionally are more loaded with Unity context than actual programming.
And then just as a final note, Martin asks, does KISS, or keep it simple, win over extreme code reduction? Well, I think the common interpretation of keep it simple is often misused to keep it simpler for the work you're doing. It's not. It's keep it simple in terms of understanding. And it should be understanding for you, and then it should be understanding for the consumer. So write the simplest code you need to solve the problem. In other words, don't make a bunch of classes you don't need, but then keep it simple for the consumer of the code so it reads well. It doesn't mean you get away with, well, it's simpler if I just write a million lines in line. Like, that's not how that works, right? It's about simplicity, because why do you care? Why are you trying to make, why is there even advice to make code simple? Well, because the truth is, most of the time, code isn't written once and forgotten about. There's a lot of times you're going to come back to it, you're going to add features, you're going to reread it, you're going to try to debug something. And so what you want is, the most important place to put your simplicity is on the understanding when you come back to it later. When you come back to a method a week later and you're like, oh, I have to add a new feature to this. How did this work again? I don't remember. That's where you want your simplicity. You want it at the point where your brain can very easily parse what's there and add new stuff to it. And so if you have to like write a little, if you have to make a separate extension class and hide some stuff over there, so you come back and it says, if doing the thing happens, then other thing happens, otherwise this should happen. Suddenly it's like, I know exactly what this is trying to do. And if I want to fix this, I can press my F12 shortcut, in my case, jump into the context of that extension method and very quickly make changes. So I'm not getting rid of it. But I'm hiding the stuff that's irrelevant to the intent I'm writing for my code.
There's a comment about your hair, by the way, Jason. So
He kept it simple as well.
It's pretty good. When I went in, I was like, I don't know. I don't care about my hair. I never do anything with it. I have no particular style. So the guy's like, "What do you want for your haircut?" And I said, "I don't know, man. You do this for a living. Pick something. Just whatever." He's like, "Hey, I'm here to cut your hair." I said, "I don't." And he said, "Do you want it shorter?" He said, "Okay." He said, "This much?" I said, "Okay." And then here we go. So credit goes to the hairdresser, not to me. I just basically said, "Make it less of a problem." That's basically all I
Press the randomize button.
Yeah.
yeah, I always just go in there. I'm like, do this. I just take the same picture every time, so that way I don't have to try to figure it out. Usually it's the same person though, so I don't have to do that at all. Which makes it easy.
Andrew, what's your secret?
It's very hard to find a hair person for me. So I've been sticking with the same guy for the past probably 6 years now. And he owns his own shop in San Francisco. And so I drive there, pay the toll, pay the high price for a haircut, because more often than not, it's a good result. But when I've gone to other places, it's a bad result.
Yeah.
What, is this not part of the topic? Staying on topic?
I don't like going to new places. No, this is on topic. Yeah, we gotta
They're
figure out
refactoring their hair class.
Yeah, refactoring our hair.cut.
Oh yeah, by the way, if you wanted to enter to win the giveaway, if you haven't already, just choose a race and class. I see a couple people choosing them. You'll pop up on the board right there, and be ready for the battle when we kick it off. And you enter to win a Scorpion, which Andrew gave us the code for, and I believe is linked in the description. If it's not, it will be in a minute. And a JetBrains rider license. So first place will pick one, and second place will get the other one. So if you want to win that, now's the time. Just type one in and you'll pop up.
Yeah.
On a brief touch on that topic, we're not going to go into that, or at least I'm not going to, because it's too big of a topic. If you're saying how do you refactor classes, there's literally books on the topic, and one that you should read is one called Refactoring. That's literally the name of the book. That'll give you a much better guide on how to do refactoring, because refactoring isn't just about making your code look pretty. It's, as you refactor, you are effectively risking breaking it. It's realistically possibly breaking changes. And so there are safe ways to refactor to avoid a lot of complexity and risks of things going wrong. So yeah, it's something that requires a good bit of reading to do well.
I will give one more tip. There is a site called Refactoring Guru, which you should go to, and you should read what's in there if you do care about refactoring heavily. That said, refactoring is a thing that happens as you make your changes, and you see that the things that you had before are no longer what you think you should have. What you should have is code that is easy to work with for you and that does what it says it does. So if you don't ever meet these requirements, refactor your code until you do.
Is that the refactoring book by Martin Fowler story that you're talking about?
Yeah, there's two. There's the Martin Fowler Refactoring, and there's another one called Working Effectively with Legacy Code. There's the two kind of premier books on the concept of refactoring.
That one,
But
I've
that
seen,
one is
Working
legacy.
with Legacy Code is a good. I mean, it was a good book back then. It's been a long time since I saw it, but it was great.
It still holds up. I think it's the reason I don't go to that one first is because it's a lot more about you've been dropped. A giant 20-year legacy project has been dropped on your lap. And someone asks you to add new features, and you feel like you're spelunking through a giant mess, and you're afraid to break everything, and you know that if you touch the wrong line of code, the whole thing implodes. How do you deal with that scenario? So it's not quite the same as the like, how do I refactor my methods to be a bit nicer? It's a much more academic, okay, I need to do this at a large level and fix old code and bring it into a more modern state. And so there's a lot more to that. That's a lot more about how to isolate features, use unit testing, how to extract features safely, how to use things like inlining slowly over time and to move out the globals to slowly get you to a position where other refactorings are easier. It's a much more complicated process. But that second book is really good if you ever find yourself working at a big company and you're like, I have to maintain a system that hasn't had good practices from the start, you know?
Yeah. So
before we jump to the other file, sorry, I don't want to interrupt again, but with this class, I just wanted to briefly mention on refactoring this class, the way that I would do it is just by initially, like a real quick, cutting this part here. I would take, obviously rename it to health, take the modify health, the health max, and put those into a separate class, and then make all the rest of this into a health UI class. And I would take this little chunk right here, move it into modify health, so that you then have just two separate classes, one dealing with the health, one dealing with the UI part, and make it so that the classes can each be named for what they are. All right, let's go on to the other file real quick and then jump on
again, just because you bring up a good point. By the way, people, this is what happens if you ask for a code review. You're going to get very long, complicated responses on stuff because this is what we do. You bring up a very good point that I think has to be highlighted because a lot of people get confused by this. You're describing splitting that class up into two. And I know somebody somewhere is thinking, but it's only a few lines of code. You don't need two classes for this. And that is such a common mistake where people judge whether or not to make other classes based on size. It's not like a box that fills up and you move to another box when the first one is full. That is not what classes are for. We talked about single responsibility before. It's a whole other conversation, but I will just say the entire point is to use a box metaphor, a box should contain relevant stuff. You don't just put as much stuff into one box as you can, move to another box, and then fill that up with stuff until it fills up. You should have a box that contains one type of thing, a box that contains another type of thing. So sometimes a class may only be one line of code, so 2 lines inside of it. Others might be much larger. Don't use number of lines as your metric for this should be another class. It is a good metric if the class is so big that you're like, oh, this should be 2 classes. That's a good sign something's wrong. But the answer isn't make 2 classes. The answer is stop and assess how many things this class is doing, and that's the number of classes you need. Not just, I've arbitrarily hit the magic 200 line mark that becomes the like, now I should split to a second class. So intent matters, and as Jason said, it's doing 2 things. There is something that does UI stuff, and there's something that does health stuff. They are 2 completely unrelated things. They happen to talk to each other, they need to talk to each other, but they are not the same thing. And so splitting them up will make your life easier later, because if you decide to come along and change the health from hearts to a health bar, or the flashing shader, you shouldn't have to even go near where the code is calculating health-related values, because that's unrelated. Like, the idea that you could risk breaking the health system by changing code because you decide to change the shape of the visuals is insane. And the same is in reverse. If you want to change the health calculation to add some new debuffs or some sort of a particular like armor class or something, you may want to change the UI, but you shouldn't have to. You shouldn't be affecting the UI just because you made an algorithm decision at the core of how it works.
So for the new health file name, healthui.cs, everybody agree?
Health presenter.
Health manager. Health presenter.
Yeah, like okay, so if you were to describe this to somebody else, that you're like, I'm writing code. What are you doing? Well, I have health, and then I have this UI that shows the health. What should they be called? Health and health UI. There you go. It's like people put so much effort into like thinking like in code, but it's communication. Like how would you describe it to a non-programmer? I'm making an enemy. Enemies use weapons. Weapons do attacks. What do you call that? Enemy, weapon, and attack. Like, don't throw in systems and managers and event handling. It's worthless. Like, write the code and write the names that make sense for what you're doing.
Health UI manager system. Let's go.
I think it's Hearts UI management system because we're using Hearts right now.
or maybe just like, again, I've seen this too, which drives me insane. People call it like the Zelda system or Zelda Heart because, oh no, Zelda games use hearts, and so I'm using it's like now it's so confused. Like I've seen people write code like this, and it's like I don't know what your intent. You're assuming we have a shared language of something else, and you're using references to that. It's like insane design choices.
Okay, so are we at class 2?
Yeah.
Time?
Go ahead, Yuri.
Hey, I bet people didn't think we'd get so much mileage out of like 5 lines of code.
Yeah, so
before we start this, I'm gonna, because I know this is gonna take longer than I have left, I'm gonna cut out. I have to leave 5 minutes, but I'll leave now. So I want to thank you everybody for this, because I learned so much from this as well. Even though I've had a lot of these code reviews one-on-one with Jason in my live streams, this is great stuff. We should do more of this. I think this is fun.
Yeah, and again, if people are interested, go to Andrew's channel, and he literally writes code live all of the time. You can see him do it, and oftentimes he's refactoring it using the very stuff that we talk about here because we've talked about it together. And then occasionally I'll show up. But honestly, even just watching Andrew do his own code is very interesting because, like I said, he's changed his style over the span of the videos. You can watch for like go back 8 or 9 live streams back and just watch subtle decisions, and you can see it. You can see the philosophy of how he's choosing names and changing stuff, and you can't get a better example of like the differences because you can see how easy it is to make certain changes that were previously harder to do.
Yeah. All my live videos are up there on the YouTube. So if you go to infinitypbr.com, there's links to YouTube and all the other stuff there. So yeah.
And then later on today, we're going to give away one of Andrew's scorpions too. So
yeah,
if you're interested in winning that, make sure that you check it out. It should be in the link down below. I'm going to go put it there right now if it's not. I guess we'll see you next week, Andrew.
Yep, it will be.
And you got some big announcements coming up, right? So make
Very
sure everybody
big.
is subscribed to your email, your YouTube channel, and everything else. There's some really cool stuff coming up that everybody's going to want to see.
Yep. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah,
right,
fantastic
thanks again,
day.
Andrew. See you next week. All right. Let's move that out of the way and make sure that it's down below.
Scorpion token.
Yeah. We'll readjust our sizes here. So you want to dive into the damage controller now?
You probably do the view where it's the full thing and 3 of us at the bottom would be easier to read because even I'm having trouble seeing it on the.
Yeah, let me do that. Let's go full view 3. There we go.
Now we don't see more code, but I guess this is enough. Yeah, okay.
You can zoom out a bit, yeah, there you go.
Okay, so again, I'm just going to run down for some of the problems we've talked about before quickly. Private is inconsistent. The underscores are inconsistent. Not a big deal here, but there's a lot that this class has. If you start scrolling down, you'll see that there are quite a lot of serialized fields here. This class is doing more than just controlling damage.
Yeah, it comes back to what we were saying earlier about there's multiple classes this could be. Like it's clearly doing some UI and some damage stuff, and they're not the same thing.
Yeah, but ignoring all of that and just focusing on the execution this time, if you go to, I guess let's start it on collision enter. Yeah, so what this method does, if we just go down it quickly, there is a thing that is checking, hey, you collided with an object. If this object is tagged as enemy, take some damage. And there is also a check to make sure that under a certain circumstance, normal.y is higher than or equals to 1, return. Now,
This is never going to
this-
happen, right?
it's possible to happen if you
Oh,
are a very straight collider and you're landing right on top, or was it below, of an enemy? I think it's on top. Then this
Yeah.
wouldn't happen. But there's also a slight problem on top of that, which is if this happens, you don't take damage, but you will probably keep on moving. So once you leave the collision and touch the enemy again, even just slightly, you might take the damage. It depends a lot on the collider's shape. But this condition isn't very clear. So the first thing I would have done is making this condition be its own like method or something that or a declared field, just to explain to anybody reading this what is actually this line doing.
Right.
Because-
And I get the feeling this line probably has never worked for him either, if this is the way that it's coded. Because at 1, for people that don't know, like you got to basically hit straight up and down to get to greater than or equal to 1. You want to have a lower variance if you're trying to hit just from like some top angle. I forget what the value was, like 0.707 or some shit for 45 degrees. I always forget the math.
Yeah, okay. You can use a lot to decide how you want to make sure there is a lenience for.
But I mean,
taking
you're
damage.
pretty much never going to get it with greater than or equal to 1, right? Or am I confusing myself?
And unless you're doing very straight movements and the colliders are very specialized for this purpose, it's possible. It's just unlikely.
Yeah, but in this case, you've seen the game. It's all those little characters with capsule colliders.
But I don't know the colliders because you don't see colliders when you play. Nobody cares about how your colliders look.
This is one of those, like, if you ever find yourself writing a line like that, this is nothing to do with the specifics of the code. But a little tip I have, again, I'm not a math guy, constantly kicks my ass when I have some weird thing and I have to check the output value of a sign or something to match something else, or I'm using dot product and I'm trying to get calculated values. Oftentimes, I will literally just make a public field or put the editor in debug mode, and I will just play with the thing and see what values come out of the system, and then use that as my gauge to say what code I need to write to say under this behavior that I'm physically doing, I get that result in my code. I try not to just make base assumptions that a number will go to 0 or to 1 or to whatever.
Yeah, you want to debug. I use debug logs or just debug and break in there too. Your probably knows and understands the math behind it instead.
I do a lot of math stuff, yes. Sometimes with pain, sometimes without. So one other small thing that I would have done is I would have separated this code, like Jason Story mentioned earlier, into its own method, like try colliding with an enemy. Because when you want to implement more features later, you don't want this guard clause to prevent the other features from working. So right now it's not relevant, but you don't know what on collision enter 2D actually tries to do, aside from the understanding that this is a damage controller and you're trying to take damage when you hit an enemy. But whose damage controller is this? Why are you only checking the enemy? Now, I understand this is a short game and there is the enemy tag that is explicit, but there is an advantage to doing that. And on that note, there is an enemy tag here. And this is going to be used multiple times for the class, which means if you ever decide to change this, this enemy tag is going to have to change multiple times. So I would move this to either a variable or
constant string is what I'd go with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Depending on what you're trying to do, because tags can
in fact,
change.
actually, what I personally would do is I actually wouldn't be calling collision compare tag multiple times at all. And so what I would be doing is I would make a class called enemy, like a literal class called enemy. And we're not even going to talk about get component enemy instead. But what I am saying is even the minimum, I'd have a class called enemy and I'd use the name of function. So I wouldn't be using the string reference at all. I would have one line that says is enemy, and it would be calling tag or compare tag type of enemy, because that way it's a one-line thing, it's hard-coded, it's at compile time, and it gives me a lot more freedom. And in fact, I'd go one step further than that, and because I think we write the code, that line, collision.gameObject.compareTag, so often that what I'm really saying, collision has tag, and so back to extension methods, I probably overuse them, but that line would read to me, collision.has tag, name of enemy. That's what that line would have read from my thing.
Yeah, so that's like 5 steps forward. But to start with,
Yeah,
just
it's too far. You don't need to go that far. But
Yeah.
but just in general, avoid what's called magic strings. That's kind of what yours.
Yeah.
Saying.
Yeah, avoid magic strings and avoid repeating yourself when there is a value that you're going to have to maintain. Because if you typoed any single one of these points, you're just going to miss the feature. So not letting yourself typoing, hard coding, by having a hard typed member that you know everything is going to this one spot, and if this one spot is right, everything else is right, you're saving yourself a lot of potential typo issues later. Because strings aren't hard references by any degree. They are agreed upon serialized manners of look for this specific set of data, and if something else has this specific set of data, go for it. But when you use a reference, you know that you can never go wrong. Everything is pointing to the exact same thing.
Jason, where do you put these extension methods? Somebody asked in chat.
Again, I like to be consistent. I like things to be easy to find. And so I will often have a utilities folder or something in a project. Inside of that, I'll have a folder called extensions. And inside of that, I'll have string extensions, list extensions, image extensions. And each class will be named what it is. And inside of it, I'll put the appropriate methods for whatever it is that I'm doing. And then as a side note, this is, again, another like 3 steps unnecessarily added to that. Unity has a labeling system that nobody uses but me, apparently. And if I would highlight all of those scripts, I would mark them with name of me for my project. So it would be Jason Story. I would then mark them as extensions. And that way, if I ever needed to do a search, I could use all the various search tools and do a label search to find my extension classes. If I ever do forget to put them in the right folder or whatever, or someone else wants to find them, they can literally just type L extensions and they'll find every single extension class in my project.
So I guess we can move on to the next method after that.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. So
again,
after on collision enter, we have the on trigger enter.
Yeah. Oh, and actually, as a again complete side note to this is another architectural choice, personal preference. I don't like binding too heavily to specific Unity things in certain cases. So a more interesting example would be if I had a script that did something that took user input. So say, even if it was one line of code, it was press spacebar to change page or to go to the next thing or whatever. We've talked about how something has 2 tasks or 2 jobs. One of them is the input management there, and one of them is the action you're performing. But what's more important to me is we talk about extensibility and what you can do with the code later. As Yorai said earlier about the fact that you don't want these sorts of cascading problems where you make a change later and you're like, oh, I have to change 50 things. And so a very common use case is you want to test something. And this could be testing for debugging purposes, or this could be testing because you just want to make sure it works the way you intended to. Another one is you want to make a command pattern or system, or you want to make a control window that you can bring up that does commands. All of this is to say, if there's an action you can do, like spawn cube, and you're currently writing the line, if spacebar spawn cube, you can only ever test that by pressing the spacebar, which severely limits you in what you're doing. So what I always do is I would have the class itself have a spawn cube method, and then I would make a class which takes a reference to that class and calls its appropriate function. So if someone ever wanted to reuse that or do something else with it, they could remove that script entirely and then just not use the input portion, or write their own input portion, or change it to a different input system, or have it run on a timer, or a million other things that don't require editing the code for something that shouldn't require editing the code. Why did I bring all of that up for this? Well, because we're using on trigger enter, on collision enter. These are Unity functions that are doing something that have an external event outside of you that are triggering something in your system occurring. And so what I'd like to do, again, personal preference, probably overkill for a lot of people, is I will always have a separate class that does the event subscriptions to Unity. I would have a class that would do the on trigger enter, on trigger exit, on collision enter, any of those. And then my class would sit beside that and I'd reference it. And I would then say on trigger enter, do my class's thing. And that way, if I decide later it actually doesn't happen on a trigger enter, it happens on you exit the bounds of the level, or it happens when a timer runs off, I can then do a second script that calls that function rather than like, oh, now I have to refactor out that method, put it here, call it in the trigger, and also call it somewhere else. So it's all these like micro things that will save you future time. So long story short, I don't put logic inside of trigger enters, trigger collisions. I put them in a method, and then that method is called by those things, and those methods could be called elsewhere.
Yeah, that seems like overkill to me. Slightly.
I knew it would be. I knew
said.
that's one that one would be like contagious. So I did make it very clear that's just my personal preference. I'm not saying.
Yeah, I would go the lower extreme and just take this code here and put it into a separate method in this class instead of a whole separate class. But I could see a benefit to doing that at some point, depending on the project. But for most stuff, like I
won't do it for everything, but I do find like specific like. Again, let's all be real here. How many times have we had a painful debugging session of a bloody collision not working correctly? And we're like, they're not doing the event. Collide the and we're shouting at Unity, and it's not doing what we want, and we're testing it.
Wait, the documentation, Jason.
Yeah, and then you get to the realization, you're like, oh, this thing also needs a rigid body, or I don't have the layer set correctly, or something. And so you're in a state of confusion and unknown. Is the thing that's broken the collision, or the thing that's broken my code that's doing stuff about it? Or if I print a log, am I logging it incorrectly? So there's 3 possible causes for this thing not working the way you intend to. So you've got 3 things to debug and test. But if you have an external method, and to go back to how I'd personally do it, step 1 would be like Jason did. I'd extract the method. Then I would put a context menu attribute on top of it. So I could right-click my script and test the method would fire if it was called, without having to run any code. And then I'm like, aha, so it is a collision related issue. Otherwise, the collision could be firing, and you probably do what most people do. It's like, I don't know if this is firing, so I'm printing a message just to say fired collision, just to check if that even occurs. And so again, these are small things, but if you split things up in ways that let you debug faster, you can get a lot more done.
Yeah. On that point, another very useful tool is a breakpoint, where you don't actually have to add any code. You get to see the entire execution order entirely, and you're seeing where you're exiting accidentally, or if something doesn't happen at all, by the sheer merit of it not actually getting to breakpoint. On that note, I will play some devil's advocate and say this method is exactly as long as it should be, with the exception of the can't take
all those little spaces
that are
annoying. I don't like 63. Like all these little spaces, they should things should be equally like aligned and same there. Small thing.
Yeah.
So you just don't like the double equals true here, Yorai?
Yeah, because what you're doing is you're taking something that is already a validated condition, the Boolean, and then you're comparing it to another one. This is comparing a condition with a condition to say, this is actually the thing. But implicitly, you already know that this is storing the state. If this was equals false, I would be more forgiving, but it isn't. It's equals true. And even equals false has the not sign to be put before the actual usage.
Yeah, and again, we're talking about names here. Like literally the name is can take damage. So like another thing I see,
story. Yeah,
and the other thing too that it's another small thing, but it's just something that I do a lot, is sometimes you'll find yourself writing a method, a Boolean, like can take damage, but you find yourself always checking it in the negative with not can take damage. And that can sometimes give you a little mental sort of, oh, wait, is this a not or whatever, and it catches you off guard. If the primary use of a Boolean is to check that it isn't true, then change it to cannot take damage. Linguistically maintain whatever it needs to read the best. So it's a small thing, but if you find yourself constantly going not the variable, not the variable, not the variable, stop and ask yourself if it makes more sense to invert the actual variable itself for the clarity of what you're doing.
I shrunk this down too to be about how I would prefer to see it if I was actually looking at it. Although I would probably pull this into another method for like, deal.
You also cheated on the way.
Did I?
You changed the method name.
I fixed the method name from
exactly.
sustain health to gain health. It's just a typo.
Yeah, but it is important to point out that refactoring is simple and easy, and you should always, like, if you notice something that's wrong, change it. With the exception of if you know that your project is actually deriving information from value names, then you have to be
although
more careful.
You shouldn't. You should really, really avoid that ever being the case.
Avoid that at almost all costs. Yeah.
Another thing too. This is again small thing. This one I do think is just good practice, not just personal preference. But again, it's probably debatable. The name of a variable is directly proportional to the distance of where it's stored, and so things that are in small scopes can comfortably use small names, because the mental load of remembering what it is not hard. If you had a variable called I at the top of your class and you're 200 lines down, what's I again? Very difficult. I in a for loop, very easy. You can see the declaration, the line above you. Similarly, we've got a small function here with a collision object, and it's right there. And so collision may be a more declarative name, but like if you wanted to know what collision is, you could just look at it on 56. So personally, I would probably call that just call. Now, again, some people don't like that. That's perfectly fine. But it's all about cutting down the amount of words. And to me, it doesn't add a lot of value to me to see constantly collision when it could just be call. It cuts a lot of characters down. But again, that one I'll concede, probably just personal preference.
On that note, for the onTriggerEnter2D method, the actual proper name from the documentation and default implementation that the IDE will give you is other, because you're colliding with the other. So
I hate that one though, because I always like other relative to what? Other on its own.
So no. So it's your script with onTriggering the other, and the other game object, other collider, other normal, other, etc. Like,
yeah, I don't personally. I'm not a fan of that. I like, because especially when you go to the next step, which is what you and I probably would really do, where rather than comparing tags and things, we'll probably get a component off the object anyway. We'd probably call get component.
Yeah, I just want to make a point on that, because I actually had in my written notes for the review is that it's good to actually use compare tag here, for the simple reason that adding another component is actually less performant than if you're making a really simple game and you're just checking if you are hitting an enemy. You don't care about a property of what you're hitting. You're caring about the actual enemy.
That is true. I will say, with the code that's written here, I wouldn't make another class probably. But again, going from where I know this code goes, and I know there's the whole be careful, you're not going to need it, blah blah blah. As you start to iterate this project, what's very likely to happen is enemies will have features and things on top of it. Yeah. And so at some point, you're going to want to pass collision-related information to the enemy itself so that it can know things that it might be interesting for, bullets and projectiles and various other kinds of things. So at some point, I have a very strong feeling that these kinds of functions will eventually have a component that you'd call that passes in something and extra data. And so I'm not saying I would do it preemptively, but when I'm building a system, I will often pause and go, eventually it will do these things. I'm not going to cheat and write them in now when I don't need them. But what I am going to do is pause what I'm doing to add a feature that proves the requirement for the thing that I wish was here that I know is going to be needed. And so I might pause development on this to make some kind of health UI or some enemy UI that might need values from collisions, so I can plumb that code so it exists, and then I can leave it alone. Again, this is purely how I like to do stuff, but it's kind of a complicated explanation. But the idea would be that if I look at code and think, I know it probably won't end up like this, I will try to manufacture a scenario that forces me to develop a feature that will move it in the direction I think it should be before I continue what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's entirely fair. And you already mentioned earlier that you would have extracted this to an enemy class and asked is enemy, which would have solved all of this. I do want to make one more point though about compare tag, which is it's actually something that a lot of users get wrong when they want to use tags, because what they'll do is they'll say GameObject.tag equals the name of tag.
Yeah, 100%. Compare tag's worth mentioning, yeah.
Yeah, so explicitly calling compare tag is way more efficient. So be mindful of that. Anybody who's using tags here, use compare tag instead of equals.
Although if you're going one more level past that, I think philosophically, both you and I don't like the tag system at all in general. It's a pointlessly limiting system. String comparisons are not really a good idea for this kind of thing. Even in the best of cases, you could do just as much with indexes or something else, or getting classes. And so it's fine. Again, we're not saying change it. Don't unnecessarily complicate things. But as a general rule, I don't think we use tags that often in our code personally.
Yeah, I haven't used tags in Eons.
I know Jason disagrees there. He uses tags quite a bit. At least the first steps of stuff. I know you change eventually, but you tend to use an iterative step of tags first, and then you migrate to something else.
It depends a lot. Yeah, sometimes I'll use tags for stuff that I'm not sure if I'm going to write any code for. And then the second I decide I'm going to write code for it, I end up going away from the tag. But a lot of time I'll do that instead of writing a script just to avoid accidentally creating a script that I don't really need, that doesn't make sense, that's just there to find things. So yeah, but usually I'll go I usually try to avoid and minimize tags. I'm not a huge fan of them, but every
I also hate how they're an external dependency that is hyper dependent on someone knowing a separate file is set up a certain way, which leads to some real pain in the ass when you download an asset and it replaces your tags or changes them, or the indexes don't exist, or a million other things that should not be outside of your control. If I ever have tag-like things, I'll just make a damn class and I'll call it types.thing or players dot whatever, and I'll make a class. That way it's mine, it's in my namespace, it's included with the project, it's hard-coded, it's compile time, it doesn't require an external dependency, and it's so much easier for someone to go, which ones are relevant to this? Because tags are used across multiple use cases. There's tags for water, tags for players, tags for vision, for whatever. If I had a players object, I would have players dot or locations dot, and it would list them all only relevant to the context I'm in of trying to get the comparable players. So in general, I'm just not a fan of tags as a Unity system.
Yeah.
Two quick mentions from the comments. Somebody asks what to use instead of tags. So actively the simplest solution, just talking about clean implementation, just make a very quick mono behavior name enemy. No need for any code inside. Then when you're actually checking for if it is an enemy, then make sure that the game object has that enemy mono behavior, and that your own code just does if try get component enemy, and you can actually get the enemy value out of that. And then if not, exit early. And the other thing I wanted to mention from the comments, somebody asked about the Necromancer asset, that they bought it and they haven't used it since, and there are no videos on how. Look at the documentation. There are a lot of animated short form videos and a lot of example projects within the actual package, and the documentation covers everything.
I'm not going to lie, though. I would personally really love to see a series of videos that you make about using it, because I don't know enough about it. I could not be arsed going to learn how to use it, but if you made some nice, succinct videos on the benefits of using it, you might be able to convince me to switch.
First, find me a reason to make you want to switch.
That's fair.
You never work with animations anyways.
True. But then again, maybe it's an aversion. Maybe if I had a better reason to. No. One thing I will say too, that there's an interesting discussion in the chat. I want to just highlight something. Again, this is something I know is almost exclusively a me thing, so take this with a pinch of salt. This is overkill for a lot of people. I get that. One of the comments was about the idea of a soldiers list, and you would have a static list of soldiers, and you can access them anywhere. That's a cool feature. I do that a lot. You basically, for people who don't know, if you find yourself in a situation where you have a list of weapons or a list of locations, spawn points is a great one. If you have a list of spawn points and you want a really hacky but efficient way to access your spawn points, you can literally make a static list of spawn point in the class, and in on-enable, on-disable, it adds itself. And so you have this magic, always available static list of all of those things. Now, that can bite you in the ass later if you have things that are extending from that, and suddenly you want to have lists of subtypes and things, or you have to do filters, and it ends up getting a bit confusing. But I will still do it. Long story short, I often find that very valuable. But separately from that, here's an interesting side note on lists of soldiers, for example. It's very common for people to use lists of objects as a very first-party part of their system. You'll open up a class, and internally, there'll be list of A, list of B, list of C. Now, this is, again, very much a me thing, but I think we're talking about the philosophy of code here. If you have a list, there's a 90% chance the reason you have a list is because you want to perform operations on the list. A good example would be a list of products. There's a very good chance you're going to want to do product-related operations on the list, like get cheapest, find number of these, or get all swords or something. Now, it is, to me, that collection of things and the operations you're performing on it are intrinsically connected. Now, you might have something called an inventory, which has items in it. But the thing is, items, regardless of whether or not they are in an inventory, still have operations that talk to the concept of items. Getting the cheapest one, getting the, or can afford. I always do that. If I have a list of items, you might want to say can afford and put in a price number, and it'll only return the items that are within that range. All of this is to say, I would make a class called items, and it would implement IEnumerable of type item, and I wouldn't use a first-party list in my code in most cases. I would use an items, and then items can have any uniquely item-related stuff in it. Like, so with enemy, or in the case of like we're talking about army, like I would make a class probably called army. An army would be a list of enemies, and I would treat it like a list. You'd still be able to for each it because it extends IEnumerable. You'd still be able to do operations on it, but I could also do things like, and I have a code example of this on my GitHub where I do it with potions. You could do something like an enemy, a member of an army can drink a soldier can drink a potion, but maybe you want an army to drink a potion. Now you could for each soldier in list army, and that's a lot of stuff. But the truth is, what you're really saying is you want every member of the army to drink a potion. And so if you have an army class which implements or either extends from list or is an IEnumerable, has an internal list, there's a million ways to do it. You could just say army.drink potion. And suddenly, again, we're back to intent-based coding. So it might seem like overkill for some people, but even in inventory, I wouldn't have a list of items. I would have an inventory has items, and items is a list of items as part of what it is, but it might also be a collection of operations. So again, that's a big roundabout thing. But
and if you want to look up more information about this, it's called Leaking Implementation and Feature Envy, and there are a few other names that you could go by here, but these two should
and if you research
results.
repository path, it's not quite the same, but it's in the same vein and narratively of what we're discussing, and there's a lot to that.
Yes, so we covered the on-trigger enter and the on-collision enter. Now we're getting to the actual nitty-gritty of the damage controller taking damage. So, yeah. So the first thing here is that we've already discussed this, but the health is being manipulated outside of its own class. And then this method is also calling update health. So you previously wrote a method that would actually let you modify health.
Yes.
So these two lines would have been swapped here.
In fact, what I would probably do is find the part that's calling this and just call into health, modify health, and then pass in the damage amount.
So you shouldn't actually do that because there's actually a bit more code after the health modification that is actually relevant to this class.
Okay.
Which is starting the coroutine of the damage flickering, and if the character is dead, then you should actually start the coroutine of dying. Now, this is in the method of take damage, and there is something to be discussed about whose responsibility is it to display the damage being taken or dying. And this is going back to Jason's comment about separating the class of health from the health presenter, because all of these functions become executed by the nature of health changing in different ways. The UI updating, the character flickering, and the character dying are all responses to modifications of the root health changing. So what would have been the ideal solution here is to have an actual health class saying take damage, health.modify health, whatever we did earlier, and then from that class raise events of on health changed, and then if it was a health change, update the UI. If the character is still alive, which is probably going to be one of the parameters of the event being executed, then do the flickering. And then if the character is dead because they have no health, then call the die coroutine. But
actually, there's one small side note. I just so it's come up. I've seen it 2 or 3 times now. Ericsson has mentioned object calisthenics a few times. It's another set of rules, just like solid principles and the rest of them that guide through stuff. They're good. I like them, but actually, in particular, one in that list is called first class collections, and that's literally what I just described. That concept of having a list that is managed by an object is one of the object calisthenics rules called first class collections. And so that's they are good. Use them if you want.
Hold on, I want to just cut in real quick and interrupt because Snarf just offered to get more people memberships if we can get up to 200 likes. So if everybody hits the like button, he offered 20 more memberships, which seems crazy to me, but I mean, I can't not say awesome to that. So thanks again, and everybody just hit the like button. Also, he sent over a Odin code, so we'll put that in there for the giveaway too. So 1 year Odin code. So I guess first place winner will get to choose between 3 things, and then second place we'll do the next one. So see if we can get to 200 likes or not. All right, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but when stuff gets too exciting, I can't stop myself.
No, it's fantastic. Thank you. So
it also is a good point to mention. This is what you were saying earlier. The health controller is doing 2 things here when it could just as well be the single function as you were mentioning.
Yeah. So ignoring that entire part of how you would split this method up, when you have the damage flickering, notice how there is a flow here where if the health is higher than or equal to 1, aka there is health, lose some health, start flickering, and then if you're dead, if you don't have enough health, die. There is nothing telling you here when do you stop taking damage. Now, spoiler, the die method actually disables the colliders, therefore the character will never actually call this event again naturally, because
but yeah, that kind of falls into the side effects category, and that can lead to some dangerous, surprising expectations.
Yes. So I would have said this specific part of the die function would have actually been left before the actual responses related to what actually dying means. But the code for the method itself, aside the things we mentioned just now, in my opinion, is pretty okay for this method. Do you guys have anything else to add on that?
Yeah, there's nothing I would vastly change, except we've covered everything else before. From a naming perspective, like again, to me, I just see a health controller everywhere. It's not very valuable. I look at this and I go, I could take that entire take damage function and turn it into like underscore health dot, damage, and then pass in a number and done. Suddenly the whole thing is 1 line of code. There's like lots of these little code clarity and narrative stuff I do, but there's nothing wrong with it. It's just where do you put the code and how do you write your functions and variable names. One thing I do, and this is funny, this is one of the few rules I have which goes against everything I've said. There's certain Unity related functions that I don't like that I end up use them a lot, but they're sort of certain Unity functions force you into a Unity way of doing things. And so I like to put a nice big red flag on those to indicate to myself that they're different than the way I normally do things. And one of those is coroutines. There's something inherently about having to do effectively 2 functions and go through all this stuff and the way coroutines work. So my convention, again, I don't think anyone else does this, and I don't think it's something I recommend, but it's just something I like to do personally. I prefix all of my coroutines with CO underscore, so I know for a fact it's meant to be used in the Unity form as a coroutine. And then I make a second function named what I originally wanted to be named that consumes the coroutine. So instead of start coroutine damage flickering, I would have enumerator co underscore damage flickering, and then I would have a damage flickering function that internally calls start coroutine co damage flickering. And that way, I've hidden the kind of complexity of that, and that the concept of damage flickering is a single function name with none of the cruft of coroutine stuff in line narratively in what I'm doing.
Yeah, and there's also the advantage of if there is special behavior that should happen, instead of dispatching a coroutine every single time it's called, then you can implement that there without anybody else having to know how it's actually supposed to be done.
And you can refactor it too to be something completely different. If I decided later that I'm not using a coroutine and I decide to add dotween to my project and I do it that way, I don't have to go, remove the start coroutine function, do something else. I can just say in the actual damage flicker, delete the coroutine mention and put in a different implementation instead,
Just to show everybody, yours is more like
co underscore damage flicker, and then I do. Well, so the coroutine itself.
You made the coroutine start a coroutine in this one.
Sorry.
So that's void. That would be co underscore, and then the actual, or that would be just underscore.
No, that would be just the proper name, and then it would start the coroutine, which would have the name co damage.
So move the co underscore.
Sorry, I'm mixing it up here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and then I also use method body. Then I do expression body members, so it would actually be 1 line. It would be the arrow on the same line, and then it would be smaller thing.
And
And if we're,
just
if
to
we're being
clarify
exact,
here,
that would be on the same line. Just if we're doing it how I would do it,
just to show
and
everyone.
after the arrow, and move the after the arrow to the next line. So
and just to clarify, this is
S
just
to
an
the next line.
abstract. Just to clarify for everybody,
that
this
is how I would do it. There you go.
This is just an abstraction layer in case you ever want to change how actually taking a damage flicker works. You don't necessarily have to do this, but this is future
No,
proofed with quotations.
These aren't refactor worthy changes. It's just if I wrote it the first time, this is how I would have approached that rather than this way, kind of thing. They're sort of we're firmly in the just personal preference of certain things being a bit easier to work with later territory here.
I do the same thing, by the way. I just don't name it co_. I usually put the completely incorrect async afterwards, so I can confuse it with async and await constantly.
That's another one too. That, to be honest, that's a bad habit I have to try to fight myself with, which is I truly believe you should do thing and thing async for async functions. But I'm so averse to any character, letter, or word that doesn't add value to the naming definitions that I often don't, and then I have to chastise myself later because it breaks convention. So the adding async is something I actually have to constantly force myself to go back and refactor names to put the async keyword back in. But I do truly believe it's beneficial. I think if you're doing asynchronous tasks, you should name them async as you do it.
Okay, so continuing forward. The gain health method, this one is just relatively clean, but again, it comes down to what?
Guard clause.
Yeah, guard clause as well, but more than that, it's about the feature envy again, where you try to get another class and you're modifying its values instead of doing the thing for yourself. So for those not aware of what feature envy is that when your class tries to access something of another class that it should not have access to, and then maybe accessing that other class's other thing, you're creating a situation where you're leaking the implementation of the class you're talking to, you're exposing what it has, you know what it has, and you're messing with it so it doesn't have full control of itself anymore. You're jealous of what it has, and you're interacting with it as if it would be your own. And there are multiple problems with that, but mainly it's the lack of control later.
Also, have you noticed that 89 doesn't have to be like that at all?
Yes, that could just be a
it could have been, yeah.
And I assume you guys would both move this over to the health class, though.
Yeah,
100%. Yeah,
the modifier health
literally,
that you
and
made.
again,
yeah,
the name health controller means nothing to me here. This would literally read health dot gain health, or
Gain health,
yeah.
Make this public, put it on there, and it gains health. Assuming you're always gaining one, don't need to do anything else. Just leave it like that.
There's also again, I get so nitpicky on this stuff. It's just personal preference. Again, names add value, and so the reason you have to name 84 gain health is because you don't have a hook to what you're gaining and where. If this lived on the health class, and then the class name here was health, you wouldn't have to write health.gain health because it's health. And so all of a sudden you can even remove the extra word health there, and it would just say health.gain because it lives on the health, and so that intrinsic relationship to health is built into the sentence. And so it's a small thing, but by moving it, you even get to cut down an entire half the method name just because its context is baked into the function call itself. Again, that's a kind of a weird philosophical thing about it, but so much stuff is easier if you don't have to add prefixes if it lives elsewhere. And if you ever want to know how you can tell you're doing this, we talked about law of Demeter before. That's kind of what you're falling into. If you're ever accessing an object and then accessing an object again, and then using the result of both of those, like in this case, the health controller dot health plus health controller dot health equals thing health controller dot update. That line is shouting at you. All of this behavior belongs to the health controller. You have to keep going back to it to get more stuff because it has the stuff. And so why get the stuff from it and do it here when it can do it over there? The metaphor I used before is it's like going to a restaurant and going into their kitchen and making your own food. It's like that's what they're there for. You should say restaurant.food or get me food, not go to restaurant and say get me ingredients, get me the knives, get me, like, that's not what you're there for. And so each object should do its job, and you should talk to it as opposed to taking its elements.
Perfect.
Yeah, I can see exactly how to refactor this and just split it. I almost want to rewrite the code. Like, it's sitting there. It's like I get this urge to just go cut this, move it into health, and fix it. I just know that I don't need to, so I got to stop myself.
The refactoring pastime that a lot of developers have, and then they enter refactor hell, where they just keep refactoring nonstop, and they don't actually add any value to the project, except it's going to be prettier and potentially more complex because the refactoring didn't actually add, it removed value. But yeah, so I just continuing on that class, there isn't much left. The actual damage flickering has some nuances to it, but it's written pretty okay for what it is. You're not showing the code, but basically all that method does is it plays the take damage sound if there is an audio source, and it then plays the coroutine of changing the color, waiting, changing the color, waiting, and allowing the character to take damage after that's all done. So there are a few things to change here, and I'd like to do that slightly quicker. Because
well, I guess the only one I was going to point out was the wait for seconds caching, but I guess we're probably going to cover that anyway.
Yeah. So few things. First off, if you have a Unity component, don't use not equals null. Use the implicit Boolean operator. So you can remove that entire not equals null and just say if audio source play take damage sound. But I do want to point out that if you're checking something and not immediately using it after, there's a sign that you should probably move the check into the thing that is not directly using it. So
you'd put it down and play take damage sound instead.
Yeah, exactly. If there is no audio source, exit early or something like that. So that's one part. The other thing is, and I want to just point it out to people who haven't used coroutines a lot, the first call of your coroutine will actually happen instantly. So when you call coroutine method in start coroutine, the first execution actually happens on the moment you actually call that method, and then it will wait as soon as it reaches the first await or yield new return new something. Now, as Jason mentioned earlier, it's making a new object of type wait for seconds every single time it's waiting, and you can actually cache that by literally writing var wait amount equals new wait for seconds, and you can reuse that. There are other types of waits too that you can use, but this will be cleaner to have here. And if you have to write it in multiple spots, you can reuse it instead of allocating memory for a new one every single time. On the actual damage flashing loop, it's pretty okay as is. I wouldn't touch that. It's pretty intuitive to see. The only thing I would expose is the colors in use, because this assumes that the color ends at color.white, which means if you want to tint your character with code later, this would actually remove that tint. So if you have an exposed color, you can set what color the character should be at, and when the flashing is done, it will return to that color.
One thing as well is, so this is using lowercase c color, which even if I hadn't seen the other class, would tell me that this is a field probably and not a property, because usually it's fields lowercase, properties uppercase. And what I don't like about that is if you decide later to do something, some kind of guard check or some default reassignment or something inside those functions, you can't do that without rewriting these lines of code. And so a good example there is that's where I would want to have, like, imagine you wanted to fire an event whenever color is changed. You literally can't do that at the moment because you don't know when it's happening, because you've got no way of finding that out. And you have a lot of work ahead of you to figure out a way to do that. So the best way is if the damage taker had a property called color and you were assigning to the property, then that's why you shouldn't have a public fields in general.
I feel like damage taker is just a bad name because it's a sprite renderer.
I'm not a fan of like,
it's a confusing one.
Names, yeah.
Yeah, so one more thing. Stuart Heath said, don't forget the null conditional operator. I didn't forget. Unity actually doesn't let you use this because there is more to a game object not being set
Yeah,
than just
null and
being null.
null and game object stuff is very, very dangerous territory. A lot of weird stuff happens.
So if you want to look for this, look for the implicit Boolean operator and null checking in Unity. There is a documentation page that explains what the problem is, but basically the game objects live in the C++ side, and there is more code than just your game object is not assigned, because once it's destroyed, your C# side keeps the assignment, but the game object is no longer usable, and its components are destroyed, no longer usable, but not null. So this is why you should use the implicit Boolean operator and not the question mark dot whatever code you want. It will not protect you against destruction. Got that name? That sentence sounded edgy.
Yeah, I wish I could find the JetBrains article on it. There's one that pops up in Rider that explains exactly why. And for anybody who doesn't know, it's essentially what happens is the object gets destroyed, but it's not marked as null immediately or right away. So you can have it fail a null check, but still be null, and then it blows up on the underlying side. It's something I really wish that they could address.
That bug, man. I've had so many times from that where like I've consumed some API or some other code from some library, and it's giving me random nulls and stuff isn't right, and it's so hard to figure out what's going on because you don't expect that to happen.
What about the is null and is not null options? Do those have the same problem with Unity game objects?
I haven't actively checked, but I think they do have the problem.
I'll put it this way. I don't use anything other than the not and normal operator in Unity for any game object ever. All those other ones I use in my own classes. If it's ever based on a mono behavior or a game object or Unity engine.object, if anything extends from that, I will never use anything fancier than literally just putting its value in an if statement or putting an exclamation mark in front of it. The only times. And even then, to get into a much wider philosophical debate on this stuff, null checks are expensive. Null checks in Unity are even more expensive because if this was part of the project and you F12'd into it, you'd see you're going down like 9 method calls for this null check. It's doing a whole load of stuff. And the truth is, you shouldn't be checking. Before you do actions, you shouldn't need to check. There's a general idea of defensive programming where the object state should be internally sufficient such that you don't need to do null checks. So what I do is I would have a method that assigns a value like set damager or set damage handler, and that would then do the value and create a Boolean and say has damage applier or damage modifier, and then I would check my Boolean flag in my cases I need to use it rather than doing the null check at all. So now I'm suddenly doing a single Boolean check and not a 6-method function call that has risks of game objects not being there, because in most cases it's going to be on the assignment that it matters. Again, different story if you're deleting the object and it's at risk of breaking in other cases and other kind of stuff. But normally, if you shouldn't be doing that anyway. In my case, I prefer to tell objects to destroy themselves, and then they do their own destruction. I almost never write code which destroys another object, and so as a result, I can pretty safely create a Boolean flag called is dead or is destroyed, and it can live and manage itself, and that keeps it a lot safer.
Sorry for the silence. It's just perfectly spoken once again. On the topic of destruction of other things, if you do have to keep a reference of something else and it is about to get destroyed, just use implicit Boolean operators everywhere. You don't need to concern yourself about it. If you do need to keep a list of game objects, you can still check for the destruction and you can still remove the elements properly. And if you do want to keep a record of what game object it is without an actual reference, you can use either get hashcode for the Unity engine objects, because they are unique for instances, prefabs, etc. They're pretty good to use. And you can also use the get instance ID method, which is doing that with an additional small check on the C++ side. It doesn't matter. It's perfectly usable, perfectly clean.
And in fun fact, if an object is ever stored in a list, or the dictionary is a great example. If you have a dictionary and the key value is a Unity object, which by the way, don't do that. Don't ever use Unity objects as your keys in your dictionaries, please. But if you happen to have done that, fun fact, it's using get hashcode as its comparer internally. That's how dictionaries work. When you look up the key to something, it basically all of the equality operations in collections are done via hash codes, not by equal functions. That's how they work.
And if I'm not wrong on that, the get instance ID just gets you the hash code after confirming it's fine. So yeah. So after we've done the damage flickering portion, there's literally just the die and play def sound methods, and there isn't a lot to go with here. But once again, the not equals.
You could say get component. Like, why are you getting component every time you call it when it's you can do that in awake.
Yeah, so there is that, and there's also try get component instead of get component and assume it's always there, because
I love try. That was my favorite additions Unity has ever added, was try get component. It's so much nicer.
Yeah.
Which line are you talking about here?
All of them. I'm not even kidding.
122 to start. Specifically.
122. Okay.
Yeah, like basically, this is an enumerator that's fired that gets a component, a sprite renderer. Like, there's no need to do that. In fact, I don't even use get components very often at all. This could literally just be a serialized field at the top. You drag the sprite renderer in, you do it once, part of your prefab, never think about it again. No messy code, no lookups and calls for your components. It's much simpler.
I wonder if it's the same one that's that death one, the whatever that weird named sprite was at the top. The damage taker. I wonder if it's that same sprite.
As a small side note, because Aaron asked a question that this is so complicated, I don't want to go over it here. I actually don't use anything too fancy with my hash codes. You can literally just take all of the values and use their hash codes, and then use an operator between them. But what I will say is equality overriding is so much more complicated than people think, especially when you're dealing with things like boxing, because just overriding the equals function for stuff doesn't do what you think it does. And also, there's iEquitable as an interface that is far better to use, because it will allow objects to be compared without implicitly casting to object for checks. And there's a lot of other stuff going on. If you want to really, really deep dive this, there is an entire course on Pluralsight that's like 4 hours long, where they go into just vivid detail on equality, just the concept of equality in C#, and it goes into all of the nitty-gritty little details about overriding the things and what you should do. It's big topic.
And if you don't want to get into this at all, and you don't want to do anything with it, Rider can actually generate all of this code for you with the
Rider does a very good job of that.
With the generate method. You can literally just say, hey, I want to generate a get hash code equatable and all of that, and it's going to ask you, what do you want to compare? And it's going to show you checkboxes, and you can literally just choose what you want, press done, and it will generate all the code needed.
Though for good personal training, don't just rely on Rider for everything. Learn how it works and why Rider's making those decisions in the first place. So go watch the video series and then let Rider automate it, but you'd better understand what it's doing.
Is this the equality and comparison course you're talking about?
Is that Simon Robbins? Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's an updated one, actually. The one I saw was for 4 or 3.5. But obviously, check the new one. It's good.
For the person asking about the impact of get component / try get component, it's more nuanced than just performance. First off, when you call get component, you're assuming that there is the component in the object. If anybody else comes and uses your script, they didn't read the contents, and they didn't send your game object just like you, they're going to have an error because they're missing the component. So try get component returns a boolean of did you actually get one, and then as an output from that method, it will give it to you if you did. So you can call code conditionally based on if you have the component, not assuming you have the component. This is something that you will tend to use more about objects that you don't have ahead of time, for example, on collision, as we mentioned earlier, from trying to get component enemy.
One other small thing.
Yeah.
Sorry,
yeah,
no, go ahead.
No.
I was going to say is one of the small things on the list. If you have a look at that again, Jason, with the enables.
Which one? In here?
There's like a whole this whole slew of enables here. So personally, a little thing that I like to do here is, so in a world where we're not using get components and we pre-cache the values, so we'll do a JSON line again. I would have hypothetically, so go to line 131. All right, there's fine too. The way I would do this would be I would have something called animator, and it would just say enabled, and it would be equal to, and then it would be collider.enabled, which would then be equal to rigid body dot enabled, and that'll be equal to, and then false. And so that one line does all of those things. Now, some people don't like that. That's fine. But it means I could have that function. And then what I would do is I would take that whole thing, I'd extract it out into its own method called disable elements. And then that would be called here. And it would be a one-line expression-bodied function. And so suddenly that's a really clean single line lower. And up here, it just says disable elements or whatever. And so that way, yeah.
It's one tiny slightly caveat with that is that just be careful because these are properties and you are calling methods from changing these. So there is a cost to assigning a lot of stuff at once, but you're already paying it here. It's just a matter of doing it cleanly or not. There was one more thing with that method. Just trying to find it.
There's the sprite thing you mentioned before as well, using the
the one another thing that kind of irked me here is that there is a portion that changes the scene at the end of the diff, which feels very wrong. It's not a part of the diff per se. I would
honestly, scene management, it can get you into so many weird scenarios. It should not be littered throughout your code. There should always be something that does all of the scene stuff, and you should call into it. And like literally they use a scene manager, but I like to specifically have my own thing, and I will call into that and say like go to next level. In fact, I like to hard code that in my functions. Some people don't, it's extra work, but I would rather have a method that says go to main menu somewhere that internally just calls scene manager dot blah 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 blah. The reason being is over the course of the lifespan of a project, many things will change. One of the most common ones is at first, it's perfectly fine to just load the scene. Then later, you might want to fade out before you load the scene. Then afterwards, you might want to fade out, show a load menu, start doing whatever. Then after that, you might want to send a tips collection to the main menu that shows up different things relative to what level they're on or something. There's a million ways that could change. And if you write scene manager in here, you have to find every place you've done that and start to like move things. And again, we're talking about the open close principle. You don't want to ever have to do that. So if this was referencing something that said scenes dot or game scenes dot load death scene, then you have infinite freedom to do whatever the hell you want later, and it's not going to get you in trouble with rewriting code here.
I would do the same, but probably not yet, just because I think he only has one level. Like it looks like there's only one scene. Like there's a game scene and a death scene, and that's it. But yeah, I think
in that case, I agree with you.
You need to manage it.
And I do want to make it clear too. I 100% agree. Whenever someone like Jason says that, these suggestions I'm making are as the project grows. I will often do exactly like Jason does. I will write the first line I write. If I have a player and I want to test a player can jump, even though I do all the other stuff I mentioned, the very first line I write would be if input blah 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 player jump. I write that first, then it works, and then as I start to grow, I will start to refactor out. So I'm not saying you start by writing 20 classes, but I'm saying that as things evolve, most likely this is what's going to happen. And by the time I've written the second or third line that interacts with the scene manager, that's where I'm like, okay, 3 different places are doing scene stuff. Scene now owns its own thing. It's now a job that needs to be done by somebody.
So I think we're basically done with this class. The playing audio section is exactly the same as it was in the health class, and we've already covered that with the randomization and the story method. There is the player class to go over, but honestly, I had less feedback about that than the other ones. And this is mainly because player classes tend to get bloated with the features that get added. And it's a way more nuanced topic to refactor a character controller with plentiful features like wall jumping, double jumping, and whatever have you that is in there.
I'll 100% agree that player classes are one of the few places where I dial all of my rules down a lot and I relax a lot of my expectations because there's so much happening, oftentimes in an update loop, oftentimes it needs to be very performant. And so a lot of this modularization, like everybody knows calling extra functions is slower and calling them an update is slower still. But I don't mind paying those milliseconds in cases where you're pressing menus and buttons or you're interacting with events that happen once every 4 seconds or 2 seconds and whatever. But if you're doing consistent, always firing methods to do with calculations for collisions and ground planes and making sure the different rays are right, it ends up being just not worth those little micro costs over and over for all the function calls. So I will concede that, for example, I would use state machines for a lot of stuff, but sometimes I'll just use case statements inside a player class. It's ugly. I don't like doing it, but it's considerably faster and inline and makes sense if it's a small enough use case to do it, and it's better for performance. So don't think that I'm always going to bang the drum about hyper modularized neat names. There are times for everything, and I will be pragmatic where if it makes sense to do the efficient but ugly code, sometimes that just has to be done.
Yeah. Although if you do spend a lot of time with it and you know that you want extendable features, there is a concept of separating code by feature. And this is something that is very nuanced because characters have a lot of features to them. And you can actually start extracting things as you move along, but not the scope of this code review. I do want to point out a few things, and I think I need to really go sit down because I'm feeling sick. So can we just hop on that really quick, and I'll point out the ones that were critical to me. And
yeah, let's take a look at it. So this is the player, which is the character controller.
So I'll just give a brief overview, ignoring the bunch of serialized fields. They are all customization values. There is some audio stuff because players jump. There is a start method that just sets everything. There is one nice, interesting thing here that you'll notice: the string interpolation. That's just getting different keys for different players because apparently there is some support for multiplayer in this one. And in the update, there is something for dialogue. Keep the player moving exactly still, like pause the simulation, quote unquote, if the dialogue starts, or rather it's playing. It also handles jumping. It also handles the animator. It also does sliding. It also does wall jumps. And it also does all the actual horizontal movement. Then we have the fixed update where it's actually counting down the time you're falling and applying velocity to the character. If you're on the floor and you're trying to do anything with just movement. There are wall jump methods, there are slide methods, there is a shoot slide method, which is really interesting. And then there are methods for doing all the actual nuanced stuff, like actually jumping, actually updating the animator. It's a very loaded class. There are a lot of things.
There's specific input functions calling directly for input.
Yeah. So where do I begin here? I guess let's start with the shoot slide method. This is specifically something that's pretty easy to point out, but in shoot slide, it's a method called here, but there's the declaration for it lower. In line 125 for me, yeah. So there is a portion here where, first off, guard clauses are used. That's good, but there is if horizontal is smaller than 0 and if horizontal is bigger than 0, the only thing that changes between these two segments of code is what sensor is being used. So you are duplicating the amount of code you have and the amount of code that you're maintaining simply so that you can have two directions. And what would be easier to do is exactly that, but there is a caveat into writing the ternary operator, which is if you are not horizontal at all, this shouldn't even execute. So this ternary operator would actually not work. You have to guard clause against 0 as well earlier.
Oh yes, there's a or we do the
if it is 0, then exit early, return false.
But I mean, on this, we'd want to use that the fucking close one.
That's is and false as well. So double equals and false.
No, so what you want here is double equals,
no, I was thinking
and return false. Yeah.
Oh yeah, return false. Sorry. Yeah. I'm getting myself distracted thinking of that other the float method, the one that does the fucking close checks.
And then now you can remove the horizontal checks because and feed the sensor variable that you added instead of left.
There's also a side effect of this. We've removed something called cyclomatic complexity because you want to avoid having nested brackets in brackets, basically. So now that there's less branching paths in your code base, it's now flatter, and it's always better to have flatter code.
And there is one more thing in this code. There's a lot of in this code, but one more big thing that I wanted to point out is there are methods here that are outside of a fixed update that modify the character's velocity. Now, one thing about physical simulations in Unity is that they happen on every fixed update, not on every game update. Game updates can be stalled by having frame drops, and they can be faster than the physics simulation updates by having a really fast PC and a small simulation that doesn't do a lot. And one thing that you'll notice is that if you need to detect certain things, it's better to do it in fixed update, which is guaranteed to happen on every simulation update, than just the actual update loop, because that could miss things. If you're doing a frame drop and you're catching up on 1 full second, and in that 1 second your character bumped into a wall that it should have slayed on, but this code is being called in update and not fixed update, you might be missing that slide opportunity or ability to jump or dealing damage or whatever have you. So I would move a lot of this code that is in update into fixed update, and I'll only handle the inputs in update and feed them into the fixed update. So that's just
you'll actually see this. If you want a good example of this, the kinematic character controller is the one I tend to use in most of my projects. And if you actually look at that, their sample projects are often, they literally do the update checks, the input checks in update, they cache them to a is jumping or something variable, and then you use that Boolean in your fixed update, and then you can reassign the value to false or whatever after the checks are done. And that way you get the best of both worlds. You get the responsive input checks, you also get the reliable physics checks.
So these are the two big things that I wanted to point out in this class. I'm going to leave the rest of the review to you guys. I think I really have to go.
Hey, well, thanks for coming out, and even while you're feeling sick.
Please have a fantastic day, and make sure to check out Andrew's new assets, and the sale is coming really soon, so make sure to subscribe to his newsletter and go to his Discord server, and also check out Jason Story's Coffee, and remember to like and subscribe and do all of the bell stuff. So yeah, have a nice day.
All right, thanks again. You're all right. See you again next week, I assume. Cool. Well,
yeah, we got through a surprising amount of stuff. I always like doing the code review stuff because it tends to be for something that is a very small looking script. There's a surprising amount of like fiddly little things we can point out.
Yeah, I feel like there's a ton of stuff we can talk about every time with those. So how do I get myself in? There we go. Can I get us into the right positions? I'm trying
to check the camera and you keep moving the damn thing.
Anyway, so we're kind of looking towards each other. So I guess I'm going to kick off the giveaway in just a second. So everybody that wanted to enter to win, we've got a JetBrains Rider license, a Infinity PBR Scorpion pack, and now an Odin and Specter license, a 1-year one, thanks to Snarf, who also gave out a ton of memberships. Oh, it looks like Jason Story just entered to win. All you have to do is put in an exclamation mark, and really anything. You can choose a race and a class, but if you put something else, you're just going to get random race and class combinations. The races and classes are in the chat or in the description, so you can see them all, or you can watch other people pick them, and then they'll pop up right here on the I turned off the clipping thing, the Tilt 5 board that's right behind me. So I've got that thing set up, and you can kind of see what it looks like not running in VR mode behind me with the glasses and the wand just sitting on it. But when you put the headset on, like I can actually see all the holograms. It's pretty freaking cool. I've been having a lot of fun playing with that thing this week. Actually, I wanted to ask you about that for some ideas, and maybe everybody in chat too. But one of the things that I started building last night and I got kind of distracted with it was this platformer. So I took one of the cube worlds. I think it's the CubeOS or CubeRock. I forget how you spell it. The one that starts with a K on the asset store. I took that pack and I started making like a little jumping platformer level. I took the Nature Manufacturer lava and put it down at the bottom, and then made like a little thing where you had to run around and try to get to the top. And as you start going up, the lava starts rising towards you and stuff, so you start to get some urgency. But I was trying to think of other cool ideas that really take advantage of the depth, because you can't see it right now the way that I've got this set up because I've got grass there. But a lot of the time, most of the games that I play, like there's a lot of depth down there. Like you can see all the way down. You could basically like see to the center of the earth, right? Like it gives you that that kind of effect. So I'm trying to come up with some things that are really cool and go down, like you're either traveling downwards or maybe you're going up and seeing what you've come from. So I'm trying to think of.
I always liked. I think one of the Zelda games, one of the mobile ones, had a really cool tower that you're traversing. You're circularly going around the tower, and that was always very satisfying.
That's a neat idea, because you could do like right around the edge of the tower and kind of like going down it. And you could see. Yeah, I like that. That's a cool one. Yeah, I knew it would be good to ask you and get some get something right away. If anybody in chat has anything too. Also, if you guys have questions, just game dev questions, general ones, I'll start popping some of those up too. We can go through a few of them. I think there were a couple that popped up earlier. Actually, there was one that popped up really early that I didn't take, but I was kind of curious what you think about this one, because it's kind of strange. It says, "Hey guys, I need your help. I got offered a job as a QA, so in quality assurance, but it's not in a game studio. I assume it's software QA though. And I'll be using, I mean, it must be, because it says I'm using either Unity or Unreal, and I'm a programmer. Do you think it will be helpful?" So would you take a QA job working in a game engine? If that's like, what do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
I may be the wrong person to ask, because my answer is always going to be yes to that, because I'll take every job at least once, right? I like to, from my perspective, there's so many benefits to taking literally any of those scenarios, because it gives you, it not only teaches you new skills, like you're going to be learning about an area that you don't really use that much, or that it's not as much as you could. You're going to learn new tools and software that are going to be beneficial to, even when you're not doing QA, but you go back to your own projects and like processes. You're going to learn about someone else's job, and as your job progresses, you'll find yourself working with QA people, and it's infinitely valuable to be able to speak their language and know what you're asking and how long it takes. And if they're talking about their tools, it's useful for you to know what they're actually saying. On top of that, it also gives you beneficial skills where, if you've worked as QA and now you're back doing programming, if there's something they're doing that quite frankly is inefficient or slowing you down because you're waiting for feedback, you know the tools enough to have made, or to be able to make, automations for their job, because you know what their job actually is, to make it easier for you. So I will frequently go to fellow team members and I'll be like, "Hey, I know part of your job is this. I could write you a quick script that does that for you." And so they're just like some of the like long-term benefits from it. But the truth of the matter is there's no option like that won't be valuable to you. Anytime you have a chance to take a job offer like that, go for it. Obviously, if it's not what you want to do, there's in jobs in general, there's something usually called like the 2-year rule, which is try not to stay in the same job for more than 2 years. You want to bounce around a bit, which has multiple benefits. When you switch jobs, you can change your salary. You can often add quite a big bump to it. It makes your resume look more impressive than just having 1 or 2 entries. It gives you a lot of experience, because even 2 identical jobs won't be identical in 2 companies. You've got different corporate cultures, different amounts of startup mentality. Certain places use different philosophies for design, like waterfall or agile. Different places use unique things you might have never heard of before, like mob programming, and you'll come away with a whole wealth of stuff that has got nothing to do with what you thought your job was going to be. Even like personal management skills. Honestly, you could work in a job where it's someone who is really annoying, but that'll teach you how to deal with annoying people, which is a skill you mightn't get if you don't work in a job that forces you to have to try to find a way to work with those kinds of people. So there's almost no example I can think of where it's not beneficial to just take an opportunity like that if you have it. A lot of people think it's like giving up on your dream if you're not taking the ideal thing or whatever. Like, it's all experience, and it's all stepping you in direction. Do you think you were more or less likely to get your dream job as programming if you have more experience than less, right? Like, there's no scenario where it's going to do you more harm. If you're telling me, should I take this job or this job, it's a different story. But if the answer is, I have a job offer and it's going to teach me new things, should I take it? Then always yes, personally.
Yeah, unless there's a better option and you've got something else popping up. I'm a big fan of jumping on almost any opportunity if it's a positive, good opportunity. Like, I always do it myself and tell people, just say yes as much as possible. If the job sucks and you hate it, you can always leave. Like, it's one of the benefits about jobs. Like, you can always quit that job and find something else if you don't like it, or finding that you're not using Unreal or Unity the way that you want, you're not learning the things that you want. But yeah, I do that. And like Jason said, make sure that you're searching for other jobs too, and not just staying on the same thing forever. I highly recommend bouncing about every 2 years or so. At the very least, looking. Sometimes you get in a job and it's great, and like the opportunity is too good, and you shouldn't leave. But a lot of the times, you should be evaluating at least every 2 years to see and make sure that make sure that you're getting the best opportunities, I guess. Here's another question that's kind of a follow-up on that. On this, well, let me do the next one first. So this, I recently got laid off after 18 years, looking for a new job, thinking Unity would be fun with 6+ years of Unity. What should I look for in game jobs that I could actually do? Well, with 6+ years in Unity, I would expect you could probably do most of the junior to intermediate jobs with no problem. Maybe some of the senior jobs, but depends what those 6 years were like. But I would start just looking around. And I was actually talking to another person yesterday about this, about the Unity forums. The job forums are kind of live and kicking again. I don't know if you've seen them recently, but if you look at the Unity job forums, they're like loaded up with positions that are like actively hiring, lots of full-time, part-time, and contract stuff. And there's a big variety of different things, some game stuff, some enterprise stuff, a lot of VR and AR things as well. It's now, I think, probably back to being the number one place for looking for Unity specific jobs, which like it used to be a long time ago. Then it got killed for Connect, and now it's back. And I think it's probably like the place where you're going to find the most like Unity specific jobs. If that's what you're looking for, there's a ton of them there. And the people that are posting them are active. You can see when the post was. It's not, a 3-year-old job posting from a company that doesn't exist anymore. I don't know if you got any other thoughts on that.
No, you nailed this. That's exactly what
Okay, here's a question for you, Jason. Why is the guy from Infallible Code not here?
He has his own job. That's why. But back in the early days of the show, he was mostly doing Unity or YouTube stuff as sort of a full-time or attempting to go kind of full-time. And then he got a really good job offer that he quite enjoys, that sort of fits a lot of stuff that he enjoys doing. And he took that, and now he's busy. So there you go.
And had a baby.
And had a baby at the same, and moved house at the same time, all three. Yeah. So yeah, there was a lot of, he had a busy schedule. If you still like his stuff, I highly recommend supporting him. The channel is putting out occasional videos, but the main thing he's focused on is he now works with a company called Thousand Ant. And they have their own channel, which is great. It's kind of interesting, with Matt Shell, and a guy who used to work at Unity, who's actually, you've probably seen his tutorials. He's the guy who did all of the really good original Unity tutorials before the less interesting ones they have now. And then, as well as that, they put out a course recently. There's a course on Udemy. It's like $20 or $30, and it's a really good introduction to a lot of the stuff we talked about from the more complex architecture side of things. He's very much into the same stuff that I am, as you know. So he's covered a lot of those topics in his course. So I would check that out.
Yeah, hopefully we can get him to pop on here again sometime soon. I think it would be fun. It's been a while since I got to talk to him. I haven't even got to talk to him about the baby. Seen the baby up close.
Well, honestly, I don't talk to him that much myself, but I do still get the occasional Christmas card with the family picture. So I know he's still doing fine.
Yeah. Here's one more question on the positions thing while we're on the topic. So how long does it take people to usually prepare for a junior developer position as a self-taught dev? I'm currently 4 months in, plan on reaching at least 11 or 12. I'd say by 11 or 12 months, you should definitely be able to get a junior one. You might be able to do it faster depending on, again, it all depends on what those months look like. If those months are 4 months of I'm working on stuff all day, 8 hours a day, constantly thinking about it, the other 8 hours a day, you can get there a lot quicker. If it's 2 hours a day or 1 hour a week or whatever, it obviously takes a lot more. It's mostly, I'd say it's more about hours than months, right? I'd say once you got maybe around 1,000 hours or so, probably good to start down a junior position. I don't know how many days that ends up being.
Also, again, one of these, junior position is a very vague term, and depending on the job you're going for, some companies want to hire a junior developer as a wears all the hats role, where they're going to basically be, even if they're not credited, a project manager as well as the developer and a bunch of other things. A friend of mine, Jeff, was in that role. He ended up having like 9 different hats he had to work on in his job in working in Unity.
If you're the only developer there and it's a junior developer role, you're the lead developer, the senior developer, and the junior at the same time, and probably the project manager.
Yeah, so like, to me, I don't really care about the title junior or senior or whatever, because that usually means nothing relative to the company. What matters more is read the description of what they want. They're either hiring a person to do this stuff, which is, in that case, junior is a kind of a misnomer, or in the other case, if you're hiring someone new to the team because you need more hands on deck, oftentimes hiring a junior is what I personally call a graduate position, where honestly, as long as they can tie their own shoes and can listen to me, they're a candidate for the job, because I need somebody who is able to sit in a chair, hear what I'm suggesting they do, has the wherewithal to go and do their own research and come back with stuff relative to what they found online. In fact, I may be hiring for someone doing that in the next few months for something. That's a different story. The point is that I think, if, depending on who you're hiring to, some people genuinely, they just want to see that you are skilled enough to use the editor and that you are a self-starter in terms of research and motivation. So honestly, I wouldn't care if someone had 4 months, 12 months, or 2 years. I would care more, do I feel like I could trust them? Could I give them a task and not have my time wasted? That's basically all I'm looking for. And that doesn't mean they can't ask me questions or they can't come back for help. In fact, I get extra worried if they don't come back for help. If they kind of are sitting in their chair scared to ask me questions, to worry about wasting my time, and then actively waste my time by not doing the thing that I assigned to them instead, that's much more of a red flag for me. So yeah, again, 12 months is probably a good estimate. I would say, if I'm actually hiring someone, to be truthful, like, that's not a graduate position, I look for 2 to 3 years. That tends to be the number I go for. I kind of think less than that falls you into a, to be polite, hobbyist position. You usually have to have been doing it for a couple of years to get to the point where I feel like you've not just learned how to write the code, but you've learned how to work on a project, which is a very different thing altogether. So to kind of to tie close to your point, 4 months of somebody working on a team with 5 people on a small game in an indie company is worth infinitely more to me than 12 months of somebody learning Unity by themselves. That doesn't mean as much, because the skills you have are exclusively working in code. You don't have the skills of time management and people management and expectation delivery and all the other stuff that I would actually want. So,
right. I want to dive in on the positions thing a little bit more in just a second. Just the last couple seconds enter the giveaway. I'm going to hit the button in 30 seconds. So if you wanted to enter, choose a race class, !mark first, and you'll be in. I'd hit the button and not talk about it anymore after that. But on the part about junior, senior, and all that stuff, I think it's really interesting, because I was literally having this discussion yesterday with developers looking for positions and not sure about like whether or not they're qualified for these ones, right? And we were going through some of the positions on the Unity jobs forums, and I found, like, one of the first ones I was trying to show them was a senior developer position, right, to do some mini games. And I showed him, I looked at it, and I could tell, like, just by looking at the title, that he'd probably self-disqualified from it because it said senior developer, that they were looking for things. And like, the first line made it sound like they were doing something relatively complex. But then if you scroll through and got to the actual application, there's a part that says, how long would it take you to make this game? So I found the little game, played it, and I was like, okay, I bet if I show him this and ask him this question, the answer there is going to be what they're looking for. Yeah. He saw it and he was like, oh yeah, probably a day, maybe less, right? Like a couple hours to get it started. And I was like, yes, that's the thing. Like, they say senior developer. When they say senior developer, they mean, can you knock out a mini game in a day? That's this little thing. Can you copy this thing? How long does that take? Not, you need to go build an MMO from scratch.
Yeah, like, I find senior developer often means we don't need to hold your hand. That's all it really means. Can you go and do it yourself? That tends to be the difference between hiring a junior or a senior. Do you need to kind of have someone help you with stuff, or can you entirely just, like, be given units of work to do? That's usually what I see that meaning.
Yeah, you can get the job done yourself. Or the other thing that really impacts it is the company size and how long you've been there. So I have to start the giveaway. So a senior developer is the person who's been there longer than the other developer, and the junior developer is the new one who hasn't had any work experience yet. It's all just around pay and pay and like prestige on the position. So you can be a lead developer when you're the only developer on a project, and it's you're still a lead developer. I don't know. I think you got to make sure just not to self-disqualify when looking at the positions and stuff. I think is probably the most important part. Like, and also when you said
I have a very bad habit for that. I have turned down many jobs that I wish I hadn't in retrospect because I probably could have done them, but I didn't feel like I was qualified at the time.
I've applied for so many things that I was pretty sure I was not qualified for. Because it's like, I don't know for sure, but a lot of the time, the problem is like every time I do, I go in for the interview and the job is nothing. It's exactly what I'm expecting, like a tiny portion of it and super simple. It's never like this complex, crazy thing that's listed in the actual job description. It's always the first 2 or 3 things, and the rest of it is almost never relevant. It's always like some idea that somebody had. The first 2 or 3 things on the list are the entire core of the job. That's why I always look for those. Like, hey, if I meet the first 2 or 3 things, I'll apply for it. That's pretty much it. And I'll update my resume so that those first 2 or 3 things are prevalent and very obvious. They're right up at the front so that they know like the things that they're looking for. They don't have to go dig through the resume and say like, oh, yeah, it's down here. It's not item number 7 or whatever. Like it should be item number 1 for what it is the position's looking for. So I always rearrange and pop that stuff up there. So I don't know. I just figured I'd share some of the job advice I've been talking about lately. I have another question that I wanted to pop to you. I don't know if you saw the video that I put out yesterday. I assume not, because I don't expect you to watch all of them.
So I was out on the tear yesterday, so I didn't do much YouTubing.
So it was a video. I linked it down below for anybody who wants to check it out later. But it was a video on script execution order. So it actually came up because I was working on something with Andrew, and everything was working fine. We duplicated an object, pressed play, and everything wasn't working. And I was like, oh, Andrew was like, oh, what's that? I'm like, I bet it's a stupid script execution order issue. Like instantly,
I hate that so much.
I knew I was like, I bet it's something that's trying to access something in Awake that it can't access because I didn't change anything.
I will almost universally, if I download an asset into a project and one of the instruction steps is make sure it's set at this execution before this, I'll almost delete it out of spite immediately because it just all it's doing is signing up for future problems that at some point something will go wrong, and I don't have the patience to deal with that later.
It is definitely a bad sign. And that said, it wasn't Andrew's code or anything that had the thing or the problem. It wasn't in one of his assets. It was just in some quick and dirty awakes that we'd done. We were writing a little bit of code together, and we had 2 awake methods, and the order of them getting called changed, and suddenly it broke things. And for me, I'm like, oh yeah, that's an easy one. I know exactly what it is. This is start now, code's fixed. But I realized like it caught Andrew off guard a little bit. Like, wait, what happened? I didn't change anything. So I ended up making a whole video about that, about the process, why it happens, and then the start, awake, and on enable life cycle. But there was a question about whether or not you think just ditching it completely. One of the things I mentioned at the end of the video was doing like a whole bootstrapper and kind of taking control over that object initialization. I was curious how you feel about that. Do you really like to do like some sort of initialization script or setup, or do you prefer to just deal with it in awakes and starts and kind of think that through on your own?
So I think this is kind of like what we were saying earlier. I know that making your own execution list and running your own updates is objectively faster. It's a better solution in the long run, but it's a hell of a lot more complicated in not only writing the code, but in future understanding for anyone consuming your code. And so it is a very careful decision to make that I try to avoid. So what I do instead is I don't completely remove them, but what I do is I really, really try to avoid those execution sequence problems. And the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to only ever have one script calling Unity functions on an object. So if I have a player and then player animations and then player sound effects and player inventory stuff and a health calculator and all these different things on a player object, the player class, just called player, will have an update method. And then every subsequent class will have something like a tick method or update info or update self or whatever. And then that player class will have a list of all of the other classes or dragged in through the inspector in the serialized fields. And then that update will call the other ones updates. And that way there's no risk of the other ones calling various different weird things, because the other classes will have their own initialize functions and their own update functions. And if something does go wrong, I can just go to the player and literally swap the order in there on that object to make sure the order is correct. I don't have to mess with trying to keep states in sync on various different things. In a really large project where performance is an issue, I might go one step further and start to register things in its own list at a project level and do the whole thing that way. I've not really had a project big enough to want to do that, but from the research I did looking into Playdead's, the inside, when they talked about their performance concerns, they said that massively benefited them for performance and reliability. Like I said, I've never worked on a 3-year-long game where that would be a thing, but I have a strong feeling that if I did, I would pivot in that direction. And in the conversation we talked about before about allowing decisions to be easier, if you do what I described, where you put all of these personal update functions being called by a player update function, if I chose to refactor that to my own managed update, every system only has one update for me to rewrite now. I don't have to go to every single class and move it. I can just register those, rename all of those update functions to update self or something, and then for each in list update self. And all of a sudden that migration is far less costly than it would have been had I had every single script managing its own life cycles.
I think that's good advice. Pretty interesting. I always just, I feel like sorry, kind of stumbling on my words and thoughts here, but I feel
sorry, I threw a lot at you there. That's how I do.
Yeah, it's just like at the beginning, I do like to bootstrap stuff, but again, only in those like huge projects, and it's not something that I do often because I can only think of like 4 or 5 projects total that that's made sense for out of dozens and dozens. Where most of the time, just being smart about using awake, start, and update properly is plenty.
Which is worth mentioning, by the way. I don't know if you covered that in the video, but the general rule of thumb for me personally is find everything in awake and then start everything in start. And that's and it may sound obvious, but it means that the reason you'll end up getting weird chase conditions and kind of different things happening and stuff going wrong, it's when you're trying to call methods in awake when the other class hasn't yet called it start. That's 99% of the time. It
hasn't called its awake. Yeah.
Well, or
you're trying to call things, and the other one hasn't called its awake.
Yeah. Well, so in both, that's a good point. I was specifically thinking awake to start, but you're right. If you've got 2 awakes that require the other one, I guess that's a good way to put it. Your awake should never rely on another awake having been called. Whatever you do in awake should be entirely self-configuring stuff. And usually the safest thing to do there is literally grab your references to things you need. And
same with on enable, by the way, which is a weird one because it gets called before start too, and with awake, which is really weird. It goes awake, on enable for each object.
But it has the value, the added addition that if you turn the object off and on again, it would re-enable, which gives you extra benefits there. So that's what you do in awake, and then in start is where you can actually start using those things because you can reliably know that every awake has been called, and so all of the things are in their setup state.
I think that I talked a bit about that. That was kind of a lot of the core of the video, switching over from awake to start and getting those things right, but mostly showing that like I didn't change anything and shit just broke, which like drive you nuts when you first start working in Unity.
There's another really interesting side effect of this on a personal level that it's very satisfying to me. I don't think people notice this, but if you have a Unity script and you have any of those functions, an update, a start, or whatever, it'll have that checkbox in the top corner of it because that object has a lifecycle now. There's a little checkbox to enable or disable the script. If the script has no lifecycle methods, it has no lifecycle, so there's nothing to lifecycle with. And if you do that and you just have methods in it that do things but don't use the lifecycle, there's no checkbox. And so that may seem like just a little visual quirk, but it means that when you have an object that's a prefab and it's got a script and a bunch of subscripts, only one is your master toggle of what it does. And you don't get into that weird scenario where you like turn off a player script, but like down here, it's running an update or a coroutine in one of the subscripts that causes weird behavior that you forgot to turn off the sub parts of it. If you do this tree structure I talk about, where you have one object that uses the other objects, you can ensure that the state of this is the one state that toggles that thing. And that way you can turn off the scripts without having to turn off the game object. Because some people would just say, oh, just turn off the game object. Well, there's a cost to turning off the game object. If you turn off the game object, it causes the entire tree hierarchy to activate and disable all of the things. And there's costs to like Unity fires events, because it's not just about turning objects on and off. It's like the whole tree activates, sends stuff down, fires the events, does all the disables, fires the lifecycle methods. And honestly, like you may not need all of that overhead. If you just want an object to stop moving for a few seconds, like if you want to stop your logic running because you've got an AI on screen who doesn't need to be active when the player's not looking at it for performance reasons, you could just have, when I look away, disable that one checkbox, so that one enable thing, and it's going to be considerably faster. Although you probably would want to disable the renderer as well, or performance, whatever. But you get the idea. The point is, it gives you 1 point of control of the entire tree of scripts, rather than having to like checkbox a bunch of stuff and make sure you don't miss one.
Right. That makes sense. Sometimes I like to just add them on so I can disable scripts. Sometimes I'll find myself adding like an on enable just so I can turn a script off so that it doesn't run temporarily. So that checkbox will appear. I wouldn't leave it there, obviously, but when I'm messing around with stuff.
I just find it simpler too. Like if you have your own personal tick method and it doesn't have an update thing, it means that like again that there's no life cycle to do. It's so much easier for me to just have my own Boolean and a single tick check. It just means the actual script itself. Again, no magic is happening. I'm always very wary when something else outside of my scripts are like doing things that activate stuff that I have no control over, and life cycles and delta times and all these things are all variables literally that are outside of my control, and I have to like remember to go to other sub windows and menus and find stuff, and I try to avoid as much of that as possible.
Yeah, I remember when I started with Unity and finding out about the magic method names and being so upset, I guess.
Yeah, I was not happy with that either. I've worked on projects where that's like I've worked on projects where for people who don't know, that's called code by convention. It's where stuff you do, if done this way, magically happens. A good example of this is if you're doing APIs in .NET, you can name things something controller, and it will magically self-register, do a whole load of stuff, and lots of things happen, which can be very good and efficient. But it also means if you misspell controller and suddenly your scripts aren't working and you're like, I forgot one L, and all of a sudden the whole thing doesn't work. Now, there are automatic tools and things that help generate those. But in general, you want to avoid code by convention.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's usually a bad sign. By the way, Snarf just noticed that we're almost to 250 likes. So if we get one more person, we can pass that too, which is amazing. And thanks again, all those memberships. It's just insanely crazy. There was a question about diagram designers or class design. Do you use any tools for doing class design or architecture? I used to, but I've gone away from all of them except for Milanote now, and I just kind of like loosely block things out instead of doing like full actual class diagrams. Where are you at with that?
I don't use them much either. But the reason I don't use them is I think philosophically that sort of large top-down design is detrimental to a code base, because I think it forces you into this rigid design mentality where you start building something complex that you may not even need, and you're making so many assumptions. It's like you're designing 50 rooms for a building when you're like, well, all I need right now is a box that I can put some stuff in. And if you follow the lean startup mentality, which I've mentioned a few times recently, it's all about just do exactly the bare minimum of what you need. Like one of my favorite examples in that book was they were talking about how if you want to prove a product works, you don't have to go and spend months building a giant prototype. You just fake it. And so there's this concept called a concierge project or some version of it, where what you do is you just like, if you wanted to make a really cool AI system that like auto scanned someone's Facebook account and did something cool, whatever, rather than make that software, have demos with clients where there's just a dude on a computer that manually does the thing that you're about to go and make the big AI to do. It's far cheaper. You can prove that the clients even want to use it. And if it turns out that it's valuable, then you can invest the time and the money. And because otherwise you're like wasting all of those resources and you get nothing for it. And in the same way, if you build a class diagram, you have to answer so many questions that you don't know yet. It probably won't be right. It's probably going to end up changing anyway. And you'll end up stressing yourself out if your code that really needs to be written doesn't match the hypothetical clean one that you wrote before. I stressed myself out by that way too many times. So I will only ever document something that already exists. I won't pre-document a system. And if I am going to document it, I would probably use something like, what is it? The diagram.io, is that the one? There's that really great free charting website.
Well, it sounds like on this one, the goal is less to pre-design and more to give like a view of the existing design, which is something I used to do a lot in Visual Studio with like the built-in.
Yeah, Visual Studio had a really good one. I used to use that a lot, where you could basically generate a UML diagram and it would tell you all the connections and how the classes fit together. That doesn't exist anymore, and there isn't a good equivalent. I've looked online for a few alternatives, and I've not found anything that I like. I admit I would like that. I would like some kind of visual top level view of my software, specifically one that's interactive. I don't just want someone to print out a giant PDF for me. I'd love to be able to like visibly see the code at different graphical fidelities, like of different complexities and stuff. Mostly because I really like looking for cycles and all the other stuff. So I haven't found one that I like. No.
Well, if anybody knows of a good one, let me know, because I can't think of one either outside of the Visual Studio one that I used to use. So we're down to the final three of the battle. So I figured I would pop them up. Let me see if I can get them. Where's the right window up here? Get them nice and big. So it looks like we've got Dan. I wish I could see the names. The camera view is terrible. What's happening there? There's multiple cameras there, and it's finding the nearest camera, and all the text is just looking at that one. I haven't actually fixed that bug. So let me see. We've got Dan. I'm going to pull over the window here so everybody can see. Looks like Dan, Neil, and...
I was going to say just one note on the philosophy of the question is to show some junior devs what class relationships look like. Put yourself in their shoes and ask yourself if when you were a junior, did you find class diagrams and UMLs helpful, or did they end up confusing you further? Because I don't know about you, but every time someone showed me a book with class diagrams, they made me more confused, not the other way around. I find if you're teaching someone code, traditionally they think in code. And so your best way to teach them is by doing small code examples.
Yeah, I found them somewhat useful for some things, but more the auto-generated docs I like the ones that do like class docs that tell me how to use things and
yeah, like the Java doc generator was great. You used to be able to spit out an entire tree structure of all of your code really neatly sort of sorted and stuff.
All right, so we've got our top two fighters right here. It looks like Dan might win this one, but you never know. What do we got? Is that a demon and a beholder? No, that's a Specter. And I've lost track. Oh, a Necromancer and a warrior. Oh, wow. This is a comeback. The Necro is making a huge comeback. The purple dude's the Necro.
It's a long fight, too. Normally, they're not that long.
All right, nice. Dan, congratulations. Oh, and thanks, Snarf. 10 more memberships. This is getting out of hand. Thank you again. And congrats to Dan. You get the choice between either a JetBrains Writer license, an Odin license, or a Scorpion, and then the second place and third place winners will get the other two prizes. Email me jason@game.courses and I will send you the prizes. Tell me what your name was and your position, and I will we'll work it all out, try to get them to you today or tomorrow. So congrats, and special thanks everybody to Snarf. If you can just say thanks to him for the ridiculous number of new memberships. 50 new members today, which is nice. More than we had totals. We've now more than doubled the membership counts, which is crazy. So congrats, everybody who got one of those and everybody who won. And thanks again. Let's shrink that window back down. I'm going to leave Dan right there in the middle for a minute as the congratulatory winner. So were there any other questions you had? I think we've got like 2 more minutes. I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to jump onto, any other questions you wanted to take, or things you wanted to talk about.
Nothing in particular jumps out at me, but again, if anyone has any last questions, feel free to fire them into the chat.
Cool. Well, if anything pops up, we can take it. If not, I wanted to mention the Cinti sale is on right now. They just let me into their affiliate thing, so I figured I should at least mention it. There's a link down below if you want to check it out. They've got everything 50% off, and I think we'll probably have some more coupons for that next time too. It'll be after the sale's over, I'm sure. We'll probably have some more gift cards to give away for some more Cinti stuff in the near future. you're interested in that, which I don't know. I am. I like their stuff. I don't know about everybody else, but I just have fun with it. Oh, and I put up a poll. I was really curious to see what everybody thinks. Let me see if I can pull that up and link it and show it. It was one that I was kind of surprised by the response of. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Community, and here's the tab. So the poll was just about the asset store and the hub window. So like in the Unity hub window, how there's just the normal window. I've always thought it would be nice if there was like a little tiny, and I mean small,
you could actually like go
with,
to the asset store from it.
Yeah, and just have like info like, hey, there's a bundle sale going on now. Click here. Like it just could be like a line of text across the top that just says like, hey, 50% off RPG stuff sale going on. Like click here. That just took you to the asset store. I've always thought that would be super nice because like occasionally I would miss sales and
because I don't even go to the asset store unless I'm literally looking for an exact asset to solve a problem. But I do open Unity Hub literally every day to work on various projects, and so having just a little like news feed thing that's like, here's the asset store stuff that's like, do you care about this? Would at least give me a quick way to check that without like having to go and check the asset store.
Yeah, I would love it like that. And like, here's a new announcement. Like if there's some new announcement, put that up there and just give me an option to hide that if I'm picky and don't want it there. But I thought it would be really handy. I was surprised that 60% of people agreed with me. I thought people would be more pessimistic about it than I am, because just my guess. But I was surprised everybody was kind of on board. So if you haven't voted in that, go to the community poll page on the YouTube channel and go vote. Let me know what you think. I'm kind of curious. Maybe everybody watching will disagree.
One question that reminded me it was mentioned earlier. Actually, I completely forgot about it. Someone before was asking about assembly definitions, and then Snarf mentioned it again now. That's a very good question. So the thing, I guess the question is, first of all, do I use them? And the answer is yes. But the caveat is they're so annoying in Unity. I found them easier to use than most people because I've been using different DLLs for custom projects for years. I have spent like 15 years where I already divide my code into non-cyclical dependencies in different DLLs. So the philosophy of what they're trying to do was like, oh, I already know this. I already do this anyway. So it wasn't hard for me to start migrating to that. And my code is naturally written that I avoid issues with dependencies. But the caveat with the way Unity does it is there is so little that you can do to control the conditional assembly building. Now, that's not to say you can't conditionally build assembly definition. You can literally make rules that do stuff, but that's, to be polite, fucking useless in a world where I can't detect what assets are installed in a bloody project. It's so annoying to me because I try to do this code, which has like, I would like to have do tween support natively built into my code using if-defs and all these kinds of like nice features. But if I do that, I would still have to put the assembly definition reference to do tween in the assembly definition. And if I do that, the assembly definition will fail when I import it to a project because it doesn't have a do tween. So I can't even write conditional code and put it in an assembly definition. Now again, I know an assembly definition is compiling, and so that's why. But the fact of the matter is, in Unity, it's not compiled yet. The point of an assembly definition, separately from just making a DLL, is where you take the code, you run those if-defs, like if Unity editor, if in input system, whatever, and you get a compiled output. The benefit of using an assembly definition rather than an external class library is that it hasn't ran yet, and you could still change the project's build targets to things like switching to Android or adding support for different things or putting your own defs in. Like one thing I had in a lot of client projects is what's called kiosk mode, where clients want to have a version of the product they can give to their clients that is like a locked down version, and then the real version that they have internally. And so I can make build targets that will automatically make 2 builds of the project with vastly different settings, with different settings turned off and menus and all this kind of stuff. So all that's to say, assembly definitions of what they're trying to do is all of the best bits of a DLL externally, but all of the niceties of having that ability to still keep control over your build targets and your switching definitions, which is, again, pointless, because if I can't detect what's in the project, I can't do it anyway. And even if I do detect what's in the project, it still doesn't work because it requires the references in the damn assembly definition. There needs to be a lookup system where I can do something and say, check if project-wide these assembly definitions are already registered. If they are, then I could do a lot of really nice stuff with assembly definitions. As is, I basically just use them. I use them to split into 3 ways. I use them to split the code into crap from other people's assets that I don't want muddying my project, and then stuff that I can use across multiple projects that I can drop in via my own package, and then one for my project itself. And I do that so that if I ever drop a script into the root of my project and not into my _project scripts directory, it'll just shout at me and say that I can't find the script. So it's like it enforces a level of tidiness and order in how things work. But what I would be doing, and I have tried to do multiple times, is split it up into different assembly definitions for systemic portions. I would like to have an assembly definition for the TextMesh Pro related stuff so that it doesn't mess with my non-TextMesh Pro stuff, and the DoTween stuff and the whatever, that I could hybridize by taking a new project and importing the portions I need. But the way assembly definitions work don't make that possible, and so they're not that useful. Yeah, there you go. That's more of a rant than I thought. You know.
And I only use them with unit tests now. Other than that, like I struggle outside of like 1 or 2 projects. I struggle to find much value there. The compilation benefit is too small for the complexity addition.
They're also just confusing. Like again, I use them a lot. I already know what they're about. But whenever I deliver a client project, suddenly they're like, this script won't work. You can't find it. I can't do stuff. They don't know what they're doing. So honestly, it's not worth it in most cases. The only time I will even really use it is if I'm delivering something in package form, like literally in a package that's not a Unity package, but in a package manager package. Because as one of my videos covers this, you can make your own packages. And if you make your own package, you can just hand it to a client. And even if you want to go even fancier, you can put it up somewhere like GitHub and give them a link where they can auto magically add it to their project. That's really good because it's your code in your place with a nice box on it. But again, that doesn't work if you need to reference things that may or may not be in the project. So yeah, very annoying.
Well, it looks like there's some desire from people to have you make another assembly definition video. So I don't know where you're at.
It's my most common. It's my most common question because I did leave one video where I talked about DLLs and then didn't do the next step where I was talking about the next part, which is how to build your own. That is probably, I'm going to have to make that one eventually. I tried to avoid making it because I think I mentioned before, it turned out more complicated of a topic. And it just ended up being like, this won't be one video. This is going to be more complicated. And until I find a good way to teach this, I'm going to teach other things instead.
Shrink it down to one video somehow. Somehow you got to condense it down to like under 20 minutes is the hard part.
Yeah.
So that you can get the whole point across before people get distracted. But I wanted to mention for everybody who's watching, if you want to find out more of Jason's advice, make sure that you sign up for his coffee page and get into the Discord server because there's all kinds of interesting discussions there. Him and Yorai are talking nonstop in there. I watch it. I get the notifications on my phone. I can see them chatting.
I also a common question I get from people about videos and stuff is they want to like see my code. I don't put a hell of a lot of stuff up on GitHub, but frequently if people ask questions directly in the Discord, I just drop scripts from my computer into the Discord as demonstrations. So if you actually want to see my code, it's in the Discord. There's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of scripts of mine in there of various things on various topics, from APIs to animations and DoTween stuff. And so that's, some people want that. There you go. It's in the Discord.
Yeah, there's tons of good stuff in there. So definitely make sure that you check it out. If you're not already in there, I would go check it out, or just ask the people in chat. They'll probably all agree with you. Also, we're almost to 300 likes. If everybody who hasn't hit it can hit the button, that would be super cool. Just past that point, I think it would be the first time ever for one of our live shows. It'd be really neat. And do you have anything else? Oh, I'm going to drop a video tomorrow on some of my favorite assets for building games fast. So the useful, it was kind of a mix of tools and other things that I wanted to cover, including one of my favorites. It's like right at the beginning of it, you see. So if you're interested in that, make sure that you subscribe and hit the little alert thing so it pops up. Oh, cool. We're only 10 likes away from 300. That's pretty close. You got any other final words? Any last things you want to mention?
Yeah, one thing just as a note, somebody asked about how do you stop babbling in a game pitch. Well, I could go into a whole big thing. There's literally a video called 30 Things I Hate About Your Game Pitch. It is the definitive video on this topic and will cover everything I would say better than I would say it.
Yes, let me pull that one up right here. And thanks again, Snarf, for even more ridiculousness and getting us up to 5 more memberships. Oh, wow. Okay.
I'm
So
guessing
this is the video.
Yeah,
everybody should go watch it. I've seen it multiple times. It's great.
It's very good, yeah. And the only other thing I guess I would say is just don't worry. I have not stopped making YouTube videos completely. It's not burnout. I'm not sort of fed up of YouTube or fed up of making content. I'm just busy. This is just it. So there will be videos in future. I'm still have plans. I still have lists of them. I've still got scripts written. I still have even partially edited videos on different machines. I also have a job. It's not my full-time thing. And as nice as it is, to be brutally honest, I have made literally $70 from YouTube entirely as the ad revenue from that so far. So you can imagine it's probably not where I'm spending currently most of my time. But I will get back to it. So don't worry. If people think I've given up, I haven't. I'm just busy at the moment.
So you just need coffee to take over as your main source of income.
I guess, yeah. Just have more people
be paid in beans from now on.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. But everybody should definitely sign up if you haven't already. All right. With that, I think we'll say thanks, and we'll see you all next week. Hopefully 6 more people like the video after the thing ends, and we'll be back to talk, I think, a little bit more about code review. And I also want to go into Yorai's networking stuff. He had some really interesting things about networking to talk about with a couple systems he'd been evaluating that I've looked at deep myself. So I think we'll have probably a long discussion about network code and that stuff if you're interested. If there's anything else you want to know about too, drop a comment in the comments down below, and maybe we'll take that up as a topic too. So thanks again, everybody. Bye.
Look.